First published by Ducklet Publishing 2023. Copyright 2023 by Janet Humphrey. All rights reserved. No part of this publication may be reproduced, stored or transmitted in any form or by any means, electronic, mechanical, photocopying, recording, scanning, or otherwise without written permission from the publisher. It is illegal to copy this book, post it to a website, or distribute it by any other means without permission. This novel is entirely a work of fiction. The names, characters, and incidents portrayed in it are the work of the author's imagination. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, events or localities is entirely coincidental. Janet Humphrey asserts the moral right to be identified as the author of this work. Designations used by companies to distinguish their products are often claimed as trademarks. All brand names and product names used in this book and on its cover are trade names, service marks, trademarks, and registered trademarks of their respective owners. The publishers and the book are not associated with any product or vendor mentioned in this book. None of the companies referenced within the book have endorsed the book. To the memory of our cat, Robert, who supervised the writing of this book. Rest in peace, our boy, we will always love you. Is like the sky spread over everything. C.S. Lewis. Jed became a side stop on the writing of the DUST series for me. DUST Book 1 had been published in September 2019 to great sales and reviews, but in the back of my mind I wanted to know why Jed has become the person he was at the time of infection by the dust. I also wanted to explore his early years, and how he overcame the shadow of the Seton brothers alongside Kitty, to start a new life invigorated and refreshed. He was a great character who deserved his own story to be told. And here it is, hope you enjoy. To my first readers, Liz, Byron, my parents, and Fiona. Thank you all for taking a chance on me, and for enthusiastically waiting for more from the world of DUST. I hope you enjoy this prequel, as much as I have enjoyed bringing Jed's story to you. Clare and Jed. Jed didn't know when he first realized his mum Clare was sad. He knew the difference even from a young age between being sad because your chocolate bar was finished, and how his mum was from time to time. He knew she loved him, that was clear from the way she protected him from those around her, but inside he also knew that she was sad more often than she was happy. Sometimes he would catch her looking at him with a mixture of pride and something else. It took him a lot of years to realize what the other was. It was fear. They had lived in squats for most of his young life, going from one derelict building to another, being pushed out time and time again by the same group of bailiffs. He had started to like one of two of them, especially Mr. James. Mr. James was always nice to him and his mum. One sunny spring day the bailiffs came again. "Come on now, Clare, you know the drill," Mr. James would smile kindly at them and say as the bailiffs entered yet another cold and drafty squat. "Pack up your things now, it's time to leave." Jed's mum would smile briefly, and start to shove clothes and food back into the carrier bags and make sure Jed had his coat on, and his belongings with him, before being guided back out into the sunshine outside. Once they were outside, Mr. James always produced a lolly from his pocket, and handed it to him after giving his mum a questioning look, which was returned by her with one of approval. She always nodded yes, and for the next few minutes Jed would watch more and more people exiting the same squat where they had come from. It was magical almost. When he was old enough, Jed would make a game of counting the people as they came out of each place they were evicted from. This morning, he got to 2011. He didn't know his numbers after 20, so he started again. That was a big building, the 2011. A large and very dusty warehouse that had been sold for development, which had never come. It had become a blot on the landscape in the city of Exeter, and eventually, after being sold again, the new developers had engaged Mr. James and his colleagues to move on the community of squatters who had made this building home. This would be the last place Jed would live with his mum, but as he sat on the wall in the sunshine licking the lolly, and watching his mum as she fumbled in her coat pocket for a piece of paper, he had no idea how his life would change forever. "Is that good, Jed?" Clare said as she came back to sit on the wall with him. Jed nodded. "Where are we going now, Mum?" "Not sure, love, just waiting for Big Mike to come back," she replied. Some of the others mentioned a boarded-up shop down on the old parade, but I think some of these know about that one too. She nodded at a group who had set off purposely towards Cathedral Square. Big Mike was one of the nicer people in the squat. Jed had known him all his life. Big Mike was a very tall man with a bushy red beard. Jed had thought that Big Mike was a Viking, and this had made him laugh when Jed had asked him one evening in the squat. Big Mike had roared with laughter but said no, he actually came from Stoke-on-Trent. What about Mrs. Hilston? Jed asked as he looked around at the people walking by them. Mrs. Hilston was their social worker, and although she was nice, the council didn't have enough accommodation for all the rough sleepers in Exeter. Mrs. Hilston had been in their lives since Jed was 4.5. Mrs. Hilston had tried to help Clare both in support and advice. Most of the time Clare managed, but she was still using drugs and alcohol which banned them from most of the shelters, though the Salvation Army shelter would let her and Jed in as long as she promised not to kick off. She had kept the promise for 3 nights the previous year, until one of the other residents had stolen a £10 note she had stashed away in her bag. Jed had been asleep, and hadn't seen who had taken it. Clare and Jed were escorted to an office upstairs, where Jed was allowed to sleep on a dusty sofa until morning. Clare curled up in a chair beside him. They were not welcome there after that. Jed and his mum picked up the carrier bags and put them into a nearby abandoned shopping trolley, and started off toward the council offices. Clare knew that it was not likely that they would be given a permanent home, but she was hoping for at least a hotel room for a few nights. Jed desperately needed a bath, as did she, but in the squat the best she was able to manage was a quick strip wash in a local pub's disabled loos once or twice a week. As they walked along, Jed noticed other people they passed gave them a quick look over and then glanced away. Jed was used to this staring and ignored it. His mum pushed the supermarket trolley loaded with their possessions, but Jed carried his school bag and a rucksack. He was strong and wiry for his age, and he was proud he could help his mum carry things now. When he was younger, she would pop him into the child seat and push him along. After a short walk, they arrived at the council offices. Clare parked the trolley at the foot of the stairs and patted Jed on the head. "Right, Jed, you are in charge of our stuff until I come back out. No talking to strangers, okay?" Jed nodded and sat down on the low brick wall next to the stairs. He wished he'd still had his lolly, but the sun was warm on his face. As he sat there, more people came and went from the council offices. Several stared at him as he waited, but no one commented or spoke to him. After a long wait, eventually his mum came back down the stairs. Jed looked at her. She'd been crying, he realized. Behind her was Mrs. Hilston, the social worker, who looked sad as well. Clare sat down beside her son and cuddled him fiercely. "Jed, Mrs. Hilston is going to look after you for a short while. I need to get some help, and she can look after you better than I can at the moment." Jed squirmed in her grasp. "No. No," his voice got louder, which made more people stare at him. Clare took his face in her hands. "Yes, Jed, this is what is best. Once I am well again, you and I can be together, but she's right, you need more than I can give you at the moment." Jed sobbed as she looked at him with such love that it broke his heart. Mrs. Hilston came down the stairs and stood beside them quietly. "We've got a lovely room all set up for you in a home just down the road." Clare looked up at Mrs. Hilston and nodded. Mrs. Hilston then looked at Jed and said, "Come on, Jed, bring your bags and we will go and get you set up." "Mum? You are coming too?" Clare shook her head sadly. "No, Jed, I'm going to the hospital now." She nodded at a tall man who had come out of the offices. "Mr. Cooper here is going to take me to the hospital for a stay." Jed looked at their possessions in the shopping trolley. "Our stuff, Mum, what happens to it?" "Mrs. Hilston is going to have it stored for us both until we can come together again. It will be safe, I promise." Clare stood up and Jed hugged her again. "Now be a brave boy and go with Mrs. Hilston." She smiled at her son, who was getting so tall for his age. She turned him around and Mrs. Hilston then took his hand. "Come on, Jed, let's get you settled." He turned back and waved at his mum, tears running down his dirty face, making clean tracks as they fell. They went up the steps together and into the offices. Mrs. Hilston turned and smiled at Clare, as the man came down to help her move the trolley to the back of the building. Jed was staring up at the massive staircase in front of him. The building was one he had never been inside before, and there were loads of people all moving around looking very busy and important. To one side was a reception desk, and behind it was two ladies who were answering a bank of phones. The phones rang and each one was answered with, "Exeter Council, how may I direct your call?" They listened, and then pressed a button before the next call came in. Mrs. Hilston took his hand, and directed him to the back of the room, where a long corridor stretched out in front of them. On each side multiple doors lead to more offices and more noise. Jed didn't like this place, he didn't like the people, but he couldn't go back now. He had to be brave for his mum, so he walked and looked, and eventually Mrs. Hilston stopped at a blue door with her name on a plaque and went inside. Jed followed her in. "Sit down there, Jed, I need to make a call before we go." Jed did as he was told, and sat down on the chair Mrs. Hilston had indicated, putting his rucksack and school bag down. Mrs. Hilston sat down behind a small wooden desk. On each side of the desk and piled up around it were cardboard files. Jed looked down at the pile beside him. The top file had the name Sarah Foster written on it in black pen. Jed wondered if all of the files had names on them. He also wondered if he had a file in this office, and if so, what would it say? Mrs. Hilston picked up the phone and dialed a number. The person who answered the phone had a loud voice, but he couldn't hear the words. As Mrs. Hilston spoke into the phone, Jed continued to look around at the office and the files. He wanted to get up and walk around, but he had agreed to do what Mrs. Hilston wanted. He was a good boy and he was brave for his mum. After a short while, Mrs. Hilston smiled at him and walked back around the desk to where he was still sitting. "Right, Jed, we need to get you settled in your new temporary home." She held out her hand. "Come on, bring your bags." Jed stood up and put his bags back on his shoulder, and walked out with Mrs. Hilston back into the corridor. They walked back to the reception area, which was still busy and full of people moving around. Jed followed Mrs. Hilston back outside and down a path to the side of the building into a car park. She walked to a small car which Jed knew was a Ford Escort. It was black and quite dirty. Jed liked cars, but he hadn't been in many as a passenger. His mum didn't drive, and they took buses or walked when they needed to get somewhere. Mrs. Hilston opened the car and popped the passenger side lock for Jed to get in. Jed put his bags by his feet, and watched as Mrs. Hilston took off her nice shoes and popped on a pair of brown moccasin shoes. She smiled as she did so. "Don't like driving in my other shoes, they get scuffed," she said with no further explanation. She put on her seatbelt and helped Jed on with his one, before starting the car and pulling out of the car park onto the road. As they drive along the streets, Jed spotted some of the people he had watched come out of the squat earlier. They were sitting on a bench in the sunshine. They looked happy and contented. Jed wondered where his mum was now. "Where's my mum going?" Jed asked, as Mrs. Hilston went around the roundabout at the bottom of South Street. Mrs. Hilston smiled and didn't reply immediately. When she was across the roundabout, she said, "Your mum isn't well, Jed. She had gone with my colleagues to a special hospital where she will get the help she needs," she added. "I'm sorry that this has happened, Jed. We did hope that your mum would be okay, but she needs help and you need more stability than she can give you now." Jed didn't reply but watched the cars as they drove. "What's stability? Can I visit her?" "Stability is where you have a safe and permanent place to live, and no, you can't see her, not until the doctors are finished making her better. Do you understand what withdrawal is, Jed?" Jed thought about the question. In all the years living with his mum, there was one guy called Kimmy. His mum had explained as several of the other squat residents helped Kimmy onto a bed, that he was sweating the bad stuff out. Jed had been curious about the bad stuff. He couldn't see anything coming out of Kimmy, lying on the mattress, but sweat. He did smell bad though. Later on, his mum had explained that Kimmy had taken too many drugs, and his system was dependent on them. When Kimmy had tried to stop, the drugs had made his body crave them. Jed nodded. He didn't think his mum was like Kimmy. "Is my mum like Kimmy?" he asked. "Who's Kimmy?" Mrs. Hilston replied, puzzled. Jed explained as she drove. Yes and no. Your mum is addicted to alcohol more than drugs, although it's mostly the same results. The doctors will try and help her to not need it anymore, which should make her feel better. Does that make sense? Yes, sort of. Mrs. Hilston turned left and pulled up on the side of the road. Jed looked out at a large house behind gates which had a sign on the fence, Methodist Children's Home Saving Souls since 1902, and underneath Manager Charlie Gibbons. Mrs. Hilston turned off the ignition and took off her seatbelt. Right, Jed, this is where you will be staying for a while. She helped him off with his seatbelt and they got out of the car. Jed took his bags and put them back on his shoulder, and followed Mrs. Hilston to the gate. She pressed a button on a small panel near the gate, and Jed could hear a buzz. After a short while, a voice came out of the speaker. Hello. Hello, replied Mrs. Hilston. It's Jenny Hilston. I've brought Jed along. The gate buzzed and Mrs. Hilston pushed the gate open. Come on, Jed, she urged as he followed her inside. As Jed walked through, Mrs. Hilston closed the gate, which shut with a bang. Jed jumped at the noise of the gate, but Mrs. Hilston ushered him onwards to a big blue door, which was already open. Inside, a man was stood waiting. Hello, Jenny. Hello, Jed, said the man who was watching them as they came closer. Jed didn't like the man. He wasn't sure why. Perhaps it was the brown cardigan he wore with chunky shoes and grey trousers. Mrs. Hilston replied, Hello, Charlie, as she passed the man and walked into the house. Inside there was a staircase to one side of the hallway. Mrs. Hilston seemed to know where she was going as she walked past the staircase and down a short dark corridor into a kitchen area. Sat around a large wooden table were 3 other children, all eating sandwiches. Hello, Katie. Hello, Sam. Hello, Ben, said Mrs. Hilston as she went into the room. All 3 children smiled and gave a cheerful thumbs up as each of them had a mouthful of a sandwich. This is Jed. He's going to be staying here whilst his mum is in hospital. Jed came in behind Mrs. Hilston and smiled at the 3 children. Sit down, Jed. Now, would you like cheese or ham in your sandwich? Cheese, please, Mrs. Hilston. Jed put down his 2 bags on the floor and pulled out a spare chair and sat down. Jed realized he was very hungry indeed. Mrs. Hilston took off her coat and started to make a sandwich for him, adding a small packet of crisps to the plate as well. She put it in front of him, and Jed began to eat. Okay, Jed, I'm going now to see how your mum is doing, so Charlie will show you where you will be staying once you have had your food, okay? Jed nodded. He was trying to eat his sandwich politely, but it was the best food he had eaten for days. When Jed was with his mum, food was something that they didn't have access to often. Claire had developed a relationship with some of the local restaurants and takeaway places, where she would clean and do food prep for a few hours in exchange for a hot meal for her and her son. Jed tried to think back to when was the last time he and his mum had eaten, and realized it was 2 days ago in the evening. No wonder he was hungry. Jed finished his sandwich and crisps as the other children left the room. Once his meal was finished, Jed followed the lead of the other children who had put their dishes and cups on the side of the sink, and sat back down. The man came back into the room, and stood near the door looking at him. Right, Jed, there are a few rules you need to follow, and if you do, we will get along just fine. Jed stared up at the man who looked mean. Rule number 1 is no fighting with the other kids. I've got enough to do here without dealing with bickering kids. Jed looked up at him, without showing any emotion. Jed had learned on the streets that to look scared meant you would be picked on. Rule number 2 is you don't bunk off school. You'll be enrolled at the Methodist school down the road tomorrow, and Mrs. Cooper won't take any rubbish from any of her students either. She will make sure that you spend your time right and do your homework. Rule number 3, and this is the most important one, do not cross me, Jed. I can be an evil bastard if you do, and you will regret it. Jed nodded as he realized this was expected of him. He added, Yes, sir. Charlie Gibbons smiled, but Jed noticed it wasn't a nice smile like Mrs. Hilston gave the children. Good. Right, bring your bags and I'll show you where you will be sleeping. The home. Jed got on the wrong side of Charlie Gibbons within a day. The other children were very quiet, sitting in a big lounge reading books, as Jed and Charlie went upstairs to find his room. The house was huge, spread over 3 floors. The downstairs was living space and study rooms plus the kitchen and utility room. As they walked upstairs, Charlie Gibbons waved his hands at some of the rooms they passed. On the second floor, Charlie walked down a dark green painted corridor and stopped at the last door on the right. "This is your room, Jed," as he opened the door. Inside was a small metal bed with a mattress, 2 small pillows and a pile of blankets and sheets. Alongside the far wall was a small chest of drawers and a hanging rail. "You'll be making your own bed every morning, and I do regular inspections to make sure it's tidy. You will also keep your room clean and tidy, and no eating in your room." Jed walked into the room and stared at the bed. He turned meekly and said, "How do I make my bed, sir? I've not made a bed before. My mum and I had sleeping bags." Charlie huffed and said, "Put down your bags then, you'll be doing it." Jed dropped his bags on the floor near the bottom of the bed. Charlie then instructed Jed to put the blankets, sheets and pillows on a nearby chair. Jed then took one of the sheets and laid it down on the bed. "Tuck the corners in, Jed, it keeps it neat." Jed then added another sheet on top, followed by the blankets, and tucked those in too. The pillows had fresh covers on them, and they were added to the top of the bed. Jed had to admit this was a lovely bed, even if the room was gloomy and a bit cold. "Right, see that," said Charlie. Jed nodded. "That is how your bed needs to look every morning before you come down for your breakfast. No exceptions. If you don't, then you lose a blanket, so don't moan and say I never warned you about this." Jed nodded again. His neck was starting to get sore, but he knew that this man was someone you had to defer to. "Right, put your stuff in there," said Charlie, pointing at the chest of drawers and the rail. "How many clothes do you have?" Jed picked up his bags and started to unpack them as Charlie stood over him. Jed pulled out 2 woolen jumpers which were darned but clean, 5 pairs of underpants and 3 t-shirts. "No trousers?" said Charlie. "No sir, these are my only pair. Mum said I keep on growing like a weed," replied Jed. "Okay, well there are a pile of donated clothes, let's get you kitted out, and you'll need a school uniform and some books too. Follow me." Jed followed Charlie down the corridor to another room, which was lighter and brighter than his room. More hanging rails were set up around the room, and piles of clothes were laid out on another bed. Charlie looked Jed up and down and went over to one pile, picking up some more trousers and other items. He handed these to Jed. "Try those on. If they are too long, then they can be taken up by Miss Goodwin. She's the cleaner and the cook here." Jed slipped out of his trousers and tried on the pair handed to him. They were too long but fitted him well everywhere else. "Okay, that's good," said Charlie. "Here's some more in the same size." Jed held on to the trousers as Charlie rummaged around in some other piles. Jed was handed some white shirts which fitted well, more underpants though these looked a bit worn, plus a pack of socks and a pair of worn but clean shoes. His arms ached with the weight of the items, but Charlie wasn't finished yet. Charlie went over to another rail, which held some bottle green jackets with Methodist Church School embroidered in white thread on the breast pocket. These also looked worn, and Charlie noticed Jed looking at them. "Donated by the families of other kids at the school once they leave," he commented. "Right, put that lot down and try this one on," Charlie said, handing him one of the smaller jackets. Jed complied and tried on the jacket. It smelt a bit musty, like something left in a charity shop, but as he stood there, Charlie cracked a rare smile. "Fits you well," he remarked. "That's handy, as we don't have anything smaller than this size." Jed picked up the rest of the clothes, and followed Charlie back down to the room where he was going to be staying. "Put all your clothes away and come downstairs. We've got to give you a haircut and get you some school books. You start tomorrow." Jed gulped. He'd not been to school for a long time. It was difficult to attend when you didn't know where you would be living, and yet his mum had made sure he learned to read and write. She had also been keen to expand his knowledge, and they had spent many happy hours in the library, learning about dinosaurs or space. These had been the happiest times with his mum, and he missed her dreadfully. Jed wondered where she was and how long he would have to stay here. Mrs. Hilston had said she was going to the hospital, but she didn't look ill to him, but then he remembered what Mrs. Hilston had said about addiction. Jed wondered if his mum was going to be sweating and shivering on a mattress somewhere. After putting away the clothes and his possessions in the room, Jed walked downstairs to where the other children were sitting reading in the living room. As he walked in, they all looked up at him, then back down at their books. "Hello, I'm Jed." The girl smiled at him, then indicated herself, Katie, then pointed at a skinny boy, Sam, and then a small chubby boy, Ben. "Can I sit down?" Katie pointed to a large bookcase in the corner of the room. "Better get yourself a book before Charlie comes back. He likes to see us all reading. It makes him believe we are behaving ourselves," she giggled as she pointed. Jed went over to the bookcase and looked at the books there. Most of them were Bible stories, he realized. No stories about space or dinosaurs. Jed picked up a book that had a bright cover picturing a bearded man sitting on a donkey. He walked over to the only spare chair and sat down. "Oh, that one is a doozy," said Katie as she saw the book Jed had picked up, Children's Bible in 365 Stories. "Charlie will be pleased." Jed was puzzled, but before he could ask Katie what she meant, Charlie had come back into the room. "Right, Jed, you come with me. Let's get your school books all sorted, then you will be ready for tomorrow." Jed put down the book on the chair and followed Charlie back outside and down the corridor to another room near the kitchen. "This is my office, Jed. Do not enter here unless you are asked to. No poking around, okay?" Jed nodded again. His head was starting to spin with all these rules. Charlie plucked a key out of his trouser pocket and unlocked the door. Inside was a warm and cozy space, with a desk and chair, a table with a kettle and coffee mugs, and a radiator near the window. Charlie walked over to a cupboard and opened it with another key. Inside were piles of books. Charlie sorted through, picked out several, and put them down on the desk. He added a small pile of pens, pencils, and a razor, plus a small bag with a patch in the same logo as the jacket Jed had tried on earlier. "These are your school supplies, do not lose them, we can't afford to keep replacing them." Jed put all the items into the bag. "Dinner is in an hour, so you can go back and read until Miss Goodwin calls you for dinner, then after dinner I will give you a haircut." Jed returned to the living room and put down the bag beside the chair. Katie looked up and smiled at him. "Been in the room of doom, have you?" Jed looked puzzled, so she explained, "The charity clothes and other stuff." "Oh yes, I've got some more trousers, a jacket, and some school stuff." "What's the school like?" Sam sniggered, but Katie shot him a fierce look. "It's okay. The headmistress, Mrs. Cooper, is a bit fierce, but the French teacher, Mr. Wall, is tough but fair. Don't get on the wrong side of the religious education teacher, though," Ben added. "Religious education. Miss Cartwright is a Methodist teacher from the 1930s. If it's fun or something happy, then it's forbidden. Sweets except on Sunday, playing hopscotch, or even laughing. She'll be down on you before you can say prayers for the wicked." Ben finished his speech with a roar of laughter. "My aim in life is to send her packing. I'm doing a good job, aren't I?" Katie agreed, then they all went back to their books. Jed settled into the home quickly. His first experience of a group meal came a couple of hours later. Charlie came into the room, and Jed could tell he was pleased to see all the children with their noses deep in a book each. "Grubs up. Wash your hands and come and eat." Jed followed the others into a washroom off the ground floor, with multiple sinks and washing machines. He followed Katie in scrubbing his hands clean, then marched behind her to the kitchen where he had eaten his sandwich earlier. A tall blonde lady was putting dishes of food on the table, and Ben was already helping himself. As Charlie walked in, Ben paled, then dropped the ladle he was holding. "You know better," growled Charlie as he sat down at the head of the table. "Grace first." Ben looked stricken, but Jed couldn't understand why. He didn't know what Grace was. Perhaps she was another child. His confusion cleared as all the rest of the children sat down and grasped their hands together, their eyes tightly shut. Charlie noticed Jed's confusion. "We say grace here in this house before every meal, Jed. Thanking the Lord for putting food on our table, though we are all sinners." Jed shut his eyes and mimicked what Katie had done. "Elbows off." Jed opened his eyes in shock. Across from him, Katie mimicked moving his elbows off the table. He moved them, clasped his hands together, and shut his eyes again. Finally, Charlie started to intone. After a couple of minutes of him berating how unworthy they all were and thanking God for the food, he finally said. "Let's eat." Jed opened one eye and saw Ben had picked up the ladle again. The food smelt good. Beef stew with mashed potato. Jed was handed the ladle by Ben and he helped himself, piling on stew and mashed potato. Jed looked over at Katie, who smiled at him. As they ate, Charlie talked to the tall lady who Jed realized must have been Miss Goodwin. "Got some trousers that need taking up, Hilda." "That one there," Charlie said, pointing at Jed. The lady replied in a strong Devon accent. "No problem, I'll do that after dinner." She turned to Jed and said, "Come and see me in the kitchen after your haircut, Jed, and we can get these trousers sorted." "Thank you." "You're welcome, my dear." Once the meal was over, the children put their plates and cups on the countertop near the sink. Katie, Sam and Ben went back into the living room and sat down again with their books. Charlie followed with Jed behind. Charlie walked over to another cupboard and got out a large white sheet which he put down on the carpet. "Grab that chair," indicated Charlie. Jed did so, and Charlie put the chair on top of the sheet. "Sit down then." Jed did so, and Charlie produced another sheet that he wrapped around him. Charlie then turned back to the cupboard and produced a set of clippers. "Number 4, I think." Jed didn't know what he meant, but after the shouting about his elbows he thought it best not to ask. As he sat there, showers of hair started to fall. Jed's hair wasn't long, but there was lots of it. On the rare occasions his mum had noticed, she had tried to cut his fringe, but in the end she had taken him to the barber's when funds allowed. Jed tried to think how long it was since his last haircut. He remembered it was February, and it was nearly summer now. After a few minutes the shower of hair started to fade. Jed was sitting facing away from the rest of the children, and yet he knew they were watching him. "That's better," said Charlie as he turned off the clippers. "Neat and tidy. Right, off you go and get your trousers fixed, then it will be bedtime." Jed went back out into the kitchen where Miss Goodwin was getting out an old-fashioned sewing machine and setting it up on the table in front of her. Jed was fascinated as she deftly threaded the machine, before turning to him, holding out a pair of trousers. They were turned inside out. "Try those on then, pet, it's easier to turn them up inside out." Jed did so, and as he stood in the kitchen his thoughts turned again to where his mum was and whether she was okay. Miss Goodwin glanced over at him. "It will be okay, Jed, your mum is where she needs to be." Jed felt his eyes welling up with tears, but he didn't say anything. His throat was tight, and he concentrated on putting on the trousers. Miss Goodwin took him over to a chair near the table and said, "Get up onto the table, makes it much easier to pin these." Jed complied, and stood watching her as she picked up a box of pins and started to pin the trousers to fit. "You'll be growing out of these soon enough, but for now let's get them looking right." After a couple of minutes, she asked him to get back down and out of the trousers onto the next pair. 4 pairs of trousers pinned later, Miss Goodwin said, "I'm making hot chocolate for the other children, would you like a cup too?" Jed had never had hot chocolate before, but he thought it sounded nice. "Yes please, Miss Goodwin." "Okay then, back into your other trousers and I'll bring you a cup through before you go to bed." Jed did as she asked, and went back into the living room, where the other children were again reading. "Is there a TV?" Jed asked, looking around the room. "Special occasions only," replied Sam, looking up. "Oh, and songs of praise on a Sunday," chipped in Ben. "It's over there, in that cabinet," Katie said, pointing at a large wooden cabinet by the window. Jed walked over to the cabinet, which had 2 fancy doors on the front of it. "It's locked," said Katie. "Charlie has the only key." Jed was disappointed. Some of the squats he and his mum had lived in had been wired up for electricity, and 1 or 2 of them had portable TVs. His mum hadn't minded him watching cartoons on a weekend, but only if he had done his homework she had set. Jed had not been to proper school, even though he was nearly 9 years old. His mum had said that she would enroll him when they arrived at the last squat, but she came back from the school furious because they wouldn't accept her address as valid. The social workers had been in their lives since he was nearly 5 years old, but he knew that things had got worse for them to take him away. Mrs. Hilston had spoken to the school at the time, but they had been clear that without a fixed address they couldn't take Jed into their school. So in the end, Jed had always done his homework and schoolwork with his mum, and he preferred that. Miss Goodwin came into the room with a tray of steaming mugs. She put the tray down and passed the drinks around. "Be careful, it's hot," she said to each child as they accepted the mug. Jed accepted his mug and immediately loved the smell. He took a small sip, mindful of the warning, and felt warm and toasty. It was delicious, like a liquid hug. He sipped his drink and watched the other children drinking theirs. "Good day," said Sam. "Miss Goodwin is the best at making the hot chocolate. Unlike Charlie, she gives us each a good spoonful of cocoa rather than just waving it across the top of the cup before putting it back in the tin." "Is she not here all the time?" asked Jed. "No, only 4 days a week in the evening. Most of the time she is gone by dinner time, then we have to be very quiet for Charlie," said Katie, looking worried. She brightened as she carried on drinking, "But he's okay as long as you don't annoy him. We'll look after you, Jed, make sure you know stuff." Jed finished his drink and put it back on the tray. The others were still drinking, so he went back to the chair and took out the book again. "Can you read?" asked Ben. "Course I can," replied Jed fiercely. "Why wouldn't I?" "Just you haven't turned a page of the one you are reading since you picked it up," replied Ben reasonably. "It's not a bad book once you get into it." Jed said, "I prefer space stories." "We all prefer other stories, but Charlie and the home think we need to repent, so they fill the bookcase here with all of this," replied Ben, indicating the bookshelf next to them. "You'll get a chance to take out a book from the school library tomorrow." Charlie came back into the room. "Bedtime, kids, no chatting, brush your teeth and straight to sleep." Jed followed the others upstairs, and when he got inside his room, he found 3 pairs of altered trousers lying on the bed with a note in careful script. "Taken the final pair home to finish, I'll bring them back in the morning." Miss Goodwin had been busy. Jed thought, as he got out of his clothes and into a brushed cotton pair of pajamas that were lying on his new pillow. They smelt lovely and clean. Jed's mum had never insisted on pajamas for him. Jed had always worn a long t-shirt in his sleeping bag, and sometimes a jumper too, depending on how cold the squat they were in was. Jed took the toothbrush and paste Charlie had left for him, and walked down to a large bathroom where Sam and Ben were already there brushing their teeth too. Jed was pleased when Sam moved over so he could start to brush his teeth. Ben turned and his mouth was filled with foam. He made a "gar" sound which made the other boys giggle, but mindful of Charlie's warning, Jed got on with brushing his teeth before returning to his room. He took some coat hangers, and carefully put the 3 pairs of trousers on the rail next to the new blazer. Jed then got into bed and switched out the light. His last thoughts before drifting off were to say a good night to his mum, and he hoped he would see her very soon. The next morning, Jed was rudely awakened by Charlie walking down the corridor swinging a large loud bell whilst saying, "Wake up, kids." Jed wondered for a second or two where he was, then it all came back to him. He got out of bed and walked down to the bathroom again, where Sam and Ben were standing washing their faces with flannels and soap. Sam indicated a flannel beside him. "Charlie left that for you." The flannel was rough on his skin, and the soap was medicinal in smell. "Coal tar," said Sam as he noticed Jed's reaction to the smell. "Charlie buys it because it's cheap. We get a bath 3 times a week at the moment, but Charlie expects us to wash daily." Jed followed the other boys' lead in stripping off and using the flannel to clean themselves. Katie gets her own bathroom at the moment, but expect there will be other girls coming soon. Jed got dressed in the uniform he had been given, and followed the other boys downstairs to the kitchen. "Leave your blazer off for meals," said Ben. "Don't want to start your first day with breakfast down it." Jed returned back to his room and put his blazer on the bed, before dashing down the stairs to the kitchen, where Miss Goodwin was handing out plates of scrambled eggs and toast to the rest of the children. "Eggs for you, Jed," she said as she turned to him smiling. "Yes please, Miss Goodwin," said Jed as he sat down next to Katie. Charlie came into the room as Miss Goodwin was pouring juice for them all. He sat down and accepted a plate of the food before saying grace again. As he finished, all the children started to eat. Jed was famished. He ate all of the eggs and 3 pieces of toast and would have had more, but he saw Charlie watching him and decided not to. "First day at school, Jed," remarked Charlie as he drank his juice. The others will show you the ropes, but be aware Mrs. Cooper sends me regular reports on all our wards, and if any of you misbehave there will be hell to pay. Now back up to clean your teeth before school." Jed followed the others back upstairs and brushed his teeth again. He'd never been forced to do this by his mum, but he had to admit he did like the clean teeth sensation. He went back to his room and gathered his blazer and the school bag Charlie had given him, before going back downstairs to the living room, where the others were standing waiting for him. Katie looked nice, her hair had 2 clips holding it back from her face. Jed refrained from remarking, as he knew from previous experience girls didn't like to be called nice. Charlie came into the room. "Right back home by 4:30 p.m. at the latest, and do not dawdle." Exeter Methodist Church School. The children trooped out of the front door and walked down the road, joining other groups of children who were also walking towards a large red-bricked building at the end of the street. Ben turned to Jed and whispered, "Watch out for Mrs. Cooper. Sam reckons she is Charlie's sister." Jed sniggered at the thought of a female Charlie, but as he was escorted into Mrs. Cooper's office, he realized that Sam was probably right. Mrs. Cooper was even more stern-looking than Charlie was. She was thin and waspish, with wispy grey hair arranged in a tight bun which made her face look even more pinched. She appraised Jed with a frown as he stood in front of her, his bag by his feet. "Jed Long," she said, looking at him. "No formal education, and you are almost 9. Date of birth is the 22nd of October 1990. "Yes, miss," replied Jed. "Why have you not been to school?" she asked. "My mum and I didn't have a home." Mrs. Cooper looked at him expecting more. Jed added, "The local school wouldn't take me until my mum and I had a home and we couldn't find one." Mrs. Cooper looked a little less stern as she heard this. "Well, our first job is to assess you to find out what you do know. Follow me." Mrs. Cooper guided Jed into a classroom next to her office. Inside was a small elderly man sitting at a desk in front. "This is Mr. Wall. He teaches French, but he has agreed to assess you for grading." Mrs. Cooper looked at the man who smiled at Jed. "Come in, young man, sit there. What's your name?" "Jed, sir," replied Jed, sitting down on the chair behind one of the desks. Mr. Wall came over and placed a small pile of papers down on the desk in front of Jed. "Maths, English, religious education, and this one is for your IQ, or intelligence quotient, is a measure of your ability to reason and solve problems. Do you have a pencil?" "Oh, good." Jed took out the small case and produced a sharp pencil. "First of all, write your name at the top of each page of each paper, Jed, then read them all as you tackle each one. I say that because sometimes there are trick papers and you can end up wasting a good while, only to find out you should have just ticked a single box and stopped." Mr. Wall went back to his desk and picked up a clock. "1 hour for each paper, Jed. I will tell you when it is time to move on to the next one." Jed looked pensive, but he gripped his pencil hard and waited for the first signal. "And start," said Mr. Wall as he placed the clock facing Jed so he could see. Jed picked up the first paper, which was maths. Jed liked maths. His mum had bought a book of puzzles every week, and as he got older the puzzles got more complex. She had always given him the money to pay for goods, and used that as a lesson, asking if he knew how much change he should get back. Before Jed had finished the first paper, Mr. Wall said, "On to the second one, please, Jed," as he came to collect the maths paper from him. Jed wrote his name on the second paper, which was English, and then again he read the whole paper first. He couldn't see any trick questions, and decided to complete the third essay about his favorite book. The book was called Islands in the Sky by an author called Arthur C. Clarke. He had taken the book out of the local library when he was 7 years old. His mum had told him that the author had written a lot of books, but this one was about a little boy who wins a TV contest to visit anywhere and decides to go to the moon. The TV companies say that the moon isn't anywhere on Earth, but Roy is a clever boy who points out that the rules don't specifically exclude the moon. Eventually they agree, and the boy is trained and goes to a moon base. Jed had loved the book, and one day his mum brought home his very own copy from a charity shop. The book was dog-eared and well-thumbed, but Jed had managed to put it into his rucksack before he and his mum were evicted. Jed started to write the essay, and again before he knew how much time had passed, Mr. Wall came over to collect his paper. On to the next one, please. Jed looked at the next paper, which was religious education. He could answer some of the more basic questions, but was confused about some of them. He did his best, and eventually, the hour for that paper was over. As Mr. Wall collected the paper, he commented, "Just one more to go, Jed, then you can go and join the others for lunch in the canteen." Jed added his name to the final paper, and then read through the questions. No trick ones here either, so he started to answer the questions, which he realized he enjoyed. Some were simple, like what is the color of blood, or what are clothes made of, but as he went through the questions they started to get harder. Jed did his best and finished the questions before the hour. He put down his pencil. "Finished already, Jed, well done. I'll show you where the canteen is, then I will get marking your papers." Jed put his pencil back into his bag, and followed Mr. Wall down the corridor, and across a walkway to another building. The smell of cooking chips filled the air, and Jed was pleased when they arrived to see Katie, Ben and Sam waving at him from across the room. "Off you go, Jed, I will collect you later for your grading." As Jed arrived at the table, the others were sitting down. Ben and Sam were tucking into a plate of chips. Katie was eating lasagna and salad. She said, "Just go and help yourself, give them your name, they know you are at the home. Charlie gets billed every month, but they don't say what's been eaten, which is why," nodding at Ben and Sam, "they don't eat anything not deep fried." Ben grinned whilst adding more chips to his fork. She then nodded towards a stout woman by the trays. "That's Miss Cartwright, re-teacher, she's the one to look out for." Jed glanced over at the woman. His mum would have said she looked like she was chewing on wasps. Jed walked over to the kitchen area, and copied the children in front of him, by taking a small wooden tray and putting it on the countertop. Looking at the dishes on offer, Jed decided to compromise and have both lasagna and chips. He wasn't too keen on vegetables, but he could see the lasagna looked like it had been stuffed with some grated veg anyway. After he had collected his plate, he followed the other children down the line to the till. Most of them produced cash and were given change for their meals. When Jed arrived, the young women looked at him. "I'm Jed Long." The woman consulted a list and nodded, adding a tick by his name. As he walked away, one of the other children that were in front of him said, "Another orphan," with a sneer, his friends standing around. "I'm not an orphan," said Jed fiercely. "My mum's in hospital." "Yeah, right," replied another one in the group. "Orphan." Jed looked stricken as more and more of the group started to chant, "Orphan, orphan." Katie stood up and came over and planted herself behind them. "Simon Thomas, your dad is a drug dealer and your mum steals from the local supermarket." The first boy whirled around and faced her, his face turning bright red. "That's why you can supposedly afford school meals, because your dad is peddling shit, and your mum is mugging Tesco's. Come on, Jed, your food is getting cold." She turned with a spin, and Jed followed in her wake to the table. "Well done," said Ben, forking another mouthful of chips. "Well, he deserved it," Katie replied. "The other kids here all know we live at the home, but sometimes ones like them," she indicated the group who had slunk back to another table and were looking back over at them, "need a little lesson in humility." Jed took up his knife and fork and started to eat. When they had all finished and taken their trays over to the tall storage unit in the corner, Katie said, "Right, Jed, let's go and sit in the library and you can tell us all about your first morning." The four of them went back out into the corridor, and Jed followed them upstairs into a large room filled with books. He loved libraries. They were the warm, safe, happy places he'd spent many days with his mum when they had been evicted. His mum loved reading too, and had passed on her love of books to him. Katie walked over to the large desk in the middle of the room, and spoke to the man sitting down. "Mr. Matthews, this is Jed. Can you please issue him a library card?" Mr. Matthews was a tall man with short grey hair. He looked ancient indeed, but had a nice crinkly smile. "Hello, Jed. Yes, Mrs. Cooper mentioned you are a new starter." He turned to a Rolodex and flicked through the files before plucking a small piece of card from one of them. "Here you are," he said, handing Jed the card. "Sign your name on the bottom there." Jed took the card and the pen Mr. Matthews handed him and signed his name on the bottom. He handed the pen back. "You can take out up to 10 books at a time, Any damages must be paid for, so please look after them. Jed turned to Katie, Ben and Sam with a huge grin on his face. Come on then, let's choose you some books so you don't have to face 365 Bible stories again tonight, said Sam. Jed followed them to the fiction books, and looked carefully along each aisle until he came to the section for space. He took down a large book which was titled Space Wars Fact and Fiction. He tucked that one under his arm and continued his search. When he had collected 5 books, he went back to the desk and carefully put them all on the top. Mr. Matthews smiled as he checked all of the books out. You've got 3 weeks to read those, but I suspect you might be back sooner than that, just like young Katie here. Katie blushed and didn't comment. Jed tucked the books into his bag, and followed the others to a set of sofas in the corner where Ben and Sam then asked, "So how were the exams, Jed?" "Okay, I think," replied Jed. "Didn't know much about the religious education questions, but I tried." "Sam nearly gave Miss Cartwright a heart attack once," said Katie. "He came into the class saying he had seen Jesus in the boys' toilet." "You got a detention for that one, didn't you?" Sam smirked. One of many. Well, the classes are streamed, so you will be with different people for each subject." As Katie finished, Mr. Wall came into the library. There you all are," he said kindly. "Jed, can you come with me please to Mrs. Cooper's office? I have finished your grading. Off to class the rest of you. Jed will be joining you for French next lesson." Katie, Sam and Ben trooped off to their next lessons, and Jed followed Mr. Wall back up to Mrs. Cooper's office. As he entered, he noticed she was smiling more than she had been earlier. "Come in, Jed," she said. Jed was worried, but he walked into the room and took the chair indicated. Mr. Wall sat down next to him. "We've compiled your exam tests and we are thrilled that you are with us." Jed looked even more confused as she continued. "It seems that your IQ score is very high, which is very good news for our funding, money we get for each pupil." Mr. Wall added, "Most of the children here are in the middle IQ range, but your score means that Exeter Methodist School will now receive extra funding, and you will benefit from some of that money." Mrs. Cooper handed over a piece of paper to Jed. "This is your timetable for home, and here is one which has been laminated so you can carry this in your bag at school. On the back is a map of the classrooms, and each lesson is marked here. Mr. Wall is going to be your form teacher for this coming year." Jed followed her directions across the laminated timetable she held, and saw that, as Mr. Wall had mentioned, he was to be in French class for the next period. "Welcome again to Exeter Methodist School, and we look forward to seeing your progress over the next few years. Mr. Wall will take you to get settled in your form room." Jed stood up and awkwardly shook Mrs. Cooper's hand she held out, then followed Mr. Wall out into the corridor. Jed turned to Mr. Wall. "Was my IQ high then?" He smiled and replied as they arrived outside a noisy classroom. "Yes, Jed, it was impressive, but IQ is only a small part of a person." As they entered the room, the noise level dropped dramatically. Inside were about 30 pupils, and Jed was heartened to see Katie, Sam and Ben all sitting at desks on the far side of the room. "Good morning, Form 4L, Mr. Wall said as he ushered Jed to a desk adjacent to Katie. "This is the first day of a new term. Some of you may know me already as your French teacher from last year, but this year I will be your form teacher in addition to that subject." From the back of the room a small groan went up. Jed along with a few others looked back to see Simon Thomas, the boy Katie had raged against back in the canteen. Simon winked at Jed and blew him a kiss. "Simon peut-être que ton français s'est amélioré depuis l'année dernière, oui," said Mr. Wall in a stern voice to the back of the room. "Oui, un peu peut-être, monsieur," replied Simon in a sulky voice before sliding down in his chair. "Bon, peut-être que nous pouvons maintenant nous mettre au travail. Right, class, books out, let's begin." Jed's first experience with the French language didn't go well. He had come across other nationalities in the squats he and his mum had lived in, but most of them spoke Polish or Romanian, not French. He was asked to try some basic phrases, but he was distracted by the sniggers behind him. He screwed up his face and tried again. Mr. Wall was kind and didn't focus too much on him for the rest of the lesson, but Jed felt deflated. As they were packing their bags up, Ben nudged him and whispered, "Don't worry, Jed." Jed smiled back at him and looked at his timetable for the next lesson. "You're in religious education with us," said Sam. "Come on." They walked down the staircase and into a long corridor. "This is the new block built last year with funding from the church." Jed followed them into a large spacious room with more desks than the French classroom had. Standing next to a table was Miss Cartwright, who handed them each a Bible as they entered. Jed accepted his copy and followed the others, this time sitting behind Sam. Ben and Katie were sitting 2 rows in front of them. Jed was fascinated to see what Ben meant back in the home about sending Miss Cartwright packing, but he could see her looking across at Ben with an expression that suggested that he was not her favorite in the class. Miss Cartwright focused on him. He quickly turned it into a cough and looked down at his Bible. At the front of the room, there was a very impressive-looking whiteboard that had a single word on it: God. Miss Cartwright tapped her ruler on her desk, which made a very loud noise. As she turned to the whiteboard to add more, Jed noticed out of the corner of his eye Ben leaned over with a pair of scissors in his hand and appeared to cut something in the air. Jed couldn't see what it was at first until suddenly a small plastic toy swung within Miss Cartwright's view. Jed realized it was an Action Man doll, but instead of it being dressed in the latest commando outfit, it was dressed in a white robe and appeared to have long hair. The classroom erupted into noisy appreciation. Jed realized this was possibly what Ben had been planning. He looked over at his friend and saw he was poker-faced, unlike all the other children, who were whooping and laughing at the sight of the Action Man swinging just out of Miss Cartwright's grasp. Jed smiled but just watched Miss Cartwright get more and more frustrated at both the toy, which was swinging back and forth like some sort of holy symbol just out of reach, and her class's loud cheering as she tried again and failed to wrench the toy down. Eventually she brought her chair underneath and managed to wrench the toy down. Her previous tidy appearance was now disheveled, hot and sweaty, and her grey bun released from its confines lay limply around her face. "Who did this?" she hissed, turning to the class and brandishing the doll in her hand. "This evil." Ben raised his hand. "Miss, that's not evil, that's our Lord," he said in a sweet voice Jed thought worthy of a choir boy. Jed, like the others, was trying not to laugh, but it was increasingly difficult to keep a straight face. Eventually he dug his fingernails into his palm, and the sharp pain made him calm down. The noise had attracted attention as the door opened, and Mrs. Cooper strode inside, startled not to find a class in an uproar, but her religious education teacher stood on her chair and waving a toy. "June, what is going on?" said Mrs. Cooper sternly as Miss Cartwright staggered from the chair back down onto the ground and faced her supervisor. "They're the children," replied Miss Cartwright. "They set this thing up to humiliate me." Mrs. Cooper took the doll from Miss Cartwright and examined it. "It appears to be Jesus," said Mrs. Cooper softly. She turned and focused on the class. "Does anyone know anything about this?" She looked directly at Ben as she spoke. To his credit and Jed's amazement, Ben looked calmly back at Mrs. Cooper despite her laser focus without a reply. Jed would have shriveled under her gaze, he knew, but Ben continued to just look ahead without any fear or embarrassment. Mrs. Cooper then turned back to Miss Cartwright. "Perhaps you should go and tidy yourself up, June. I can take over for this lesson." Miss Cartwright nodded and picked up her books and left. Mrs. Cooper then turned back to the class. "Let me make it very clear, if I find out who did this, you will be in detention with me for a month." She turned back to the whiteboard and said, "The lesson today will be on the subject of God in your lives." The class started to get out their notebooks and the lesson started. At the end of the lesson, as all of the children were leaving, Mrs. Cooper said, "I want no more nonsense from any of you towards Miss Cartwright, please." Outside in the corridor, a few of the pupils gave thumbs up towards Ben, who accepted the accolades calmly. As they walked down to the canteen, however, Katie caught up with Ben and said, "That was really mean, Ben." Ben turned back to her. "You said you were going to set it up so she could grab it." Ben laughed back, "But that was more fun, wasn't it?" Katie shook her head. "No, it wasn't. She was humiliated." "Perhaps that will teach her to not give me detention for getting my classwork wrong by a point then." Katie turned and caught up with Jed. "You knew about that?" Sort of yes, but it was mean not to let her catch it as it swung down. Ben knew how tall she was and it just made it horrible. Jed didn't have an opinion, but he could see Katie was upset about it. He could see that Katie was a fair person, and he too thought towards the end of the incident that Miss Cartwright looked like she might cry. Over lunch, Ben had a few more of his fellow classmates give him the thumbs up. Jed could see he was enjoying his moment in the spotlight, but he also saw that Simon Thomas and his friends were interested in all this, and Jed suspected that Ben would be targeted by them all next. Nothing happened until the following day when during English class, Mrs. Cooper came into the classroom and walked quietly over to the teacher, Mr. Hughes. "Ben Rogers, can you please go with Mrs. Cooper?" Ben gulped, but tried not to look guilty and meekly followed Mrs. Cooper outside into the corridor. She led him to a room at the end, which was empty. Jed later found out that she had turned to Ben on shutting the door and asked in a quiet voice, "Why did you do it, Ben?" Ben was disarmed by her soft tone and didn't reply immediately. "Did you know what Miss Cartwright did after your little stunt yesterday? She came to see me and gave in her notice. She felt that she had lost the confidence of the school and wanted to leave. I, however, persuaded her to stay, and I have been given information that suggested that you were behind this. Am I wrong?" Ben looked at the floor and nodded. "The information came to me anonymously, which I particularly dislike, but it does appear to be true then. You will apologize to Miss Cartwright, who is in her classroom marking papers immediately, and you will be in detention with me for a month. Mr. Gibbons will be informed of this, as you will not be back to the children's home before his curfew, and I expect you will also have consequences with him." Ben did as she asked of him, and realized when he saw Miss Cartwright again that she was indeed distraught about the situation. However, she accepted his apology with good grace, and even wished him a good day as he made his way back to the English class, who were awaiting his return. Later, Katie, Jed and Sam heard the full story and the consequences of his actions. "Charlie is going to be mad at you, Ben," said Sam. "That's the third detention this year." Ben slumped into a chair and groaned. "I know," he said. "Last time I was given the job of clearing out that basement room, cobwebs everywhere, and he knows I hate spiders." Katie tried not to look satisfied, but she was pleased that Ben had been caught. "Who told her?" asked Jed. "My bet is on Simon Thomas," said Sam. "He's never liked the fact that you are more popular than he is, even though he had that birthday party in the nightclub last month." "Nightclub?" asked Jed. "Yes, Simon's dad works for that drug dealer, Mr. C, the Turkish guy who owns that new development down by the quay. Simon persuaded his dad to allow him to have a birthday party with cocktails in the club for his birthday." "Baby cocktails," laughed Katie, "all sweet syrups and piles of fruit. His mates seemed to think they were getting alcopops." "They drink," said Jed, puzzled. His mum and the other people in the squats he had lived in often were drinking, but he'd never seen kids drinking. "Well, they all say they do, but I doubt it," said Sam. As they walked home, Ben was lagging behind. "Come on, big man," said Sam. "Face the wrath of Charlie and then it will be all over." "No, it won't," said Ben miserably. As they all arrived back at the home, Ben was further behind them. The others waited for him, and they walked inside the front door, taking off their shoes and coats. Charlie was waiting outside his office and gestured to Ben without a word. Ben walked down to meet him, his demeanor that of someone walking the plank. Jed didn't realize at the time how close this was to the truth. Later in the year, when he had started to catch the wrath of Charlie, he realized how much of a bully he was. Grief. Life became routine for Jed in the home. He got used to the different rules that Charlie had set, and was enjoying the regular work at school. Each afternoon as they got back to the children's home, they would go into the living room and start their homework. Jed began to thrive at the school despite his late start. He still didn't enjoy French, but Katie would help him by teaching him the French words for objects such as pencils or sponges. Miss Goodwin always made sure to slip him an extra sausage or egg at breakfast when Charlie was in his office taking a call. Jed had asked Charlie about his mum a couple of times, but Charlie had told him there was no news of her. The other kids in the home made a special effort the day Jed mentioned it was his birthday. Miss Goodwin passed him an extra sausage at breakfast, and although it was a school day, the dinner that evening was extra tasty. Miss Goodwin had cooked a roast chicken. Charlie had commented, "Bit posh for a Friday, isn't it, Hilda?" Miss Goodwin just shrugged and said, "Fishmonger was a bit short today, and my parents' neighbor had a bunch of chickens just going to market. I got a bargain with this one." One cold morning in mid-November, just as the children were finishing off their breakfast, Mrs. Hilston appeared at the kitchen door. Miss Goodwin looked up as she was pouring juice. "Hello, Jenny, what's up?" "Is Charlie around, Hilda?" Miss Goodwin said, "In his office." Mrs. Hilston walked down the corridor and knocked on the door. "Finish up, you lot," said Miss Goodwin. "No gawking now, you'll be late for school." A few minutes later, Charlie came into the room. "Jed, can you come to my office, please?" Jed stood up. "Leave your plate, lad, I'll clear it," said Miss Goodwin. Jed followed Charlie into his office, where Mrs. Hilston was sitting. She looked very sad. "Sit down, Jed." He did so on the chair by the window. "Your mum has not been very well, Jed, and the hospital have been treating her for a while now. She has been very sad, and—" Mrs. Hilston stopped, then gulped. "They found her dead in her room this morning." "I am so sorry, Jed." Jed stared at her in shock. "She's not dead, she was ill." Mrs. Hilston replied. "She was ill, Jed, and it looks like she had a heart attack. Do you know what that is?" Jed nodded. "Your heart breaks, we learned it in class yesterday." "Sort of. Yes. And she is never coming back to collect me." "No." On hearing this finality, Jed's whole body was racked with sobs, and Mrs. Hilston took him into her arms and let him weep. She looked over at Charlie. "He won't be at school today, can you let them know?" Charlie nodded and went out of the room. Outside, the other children were crowded around on the stairs trying to hear what was happening. Jed's sobs clearly echoed around the hallway. "Come on now, get ready for school," Charlie gruffly said to them all. "Jed's had some bad news, so he won't be at school today." The children were visibly upset. Jed was the only one of them still with a parent that might have one day collected him, which had given them all hope of adoption in the future. Katie's parents had been killed in a crash when she was 3, Ben's mum abandoned him at the church when he was a baby, and Sam's parents had adopted him from Russia, but their lifestyle wasn't suited to children and they gave him up back to the authorities. The last time Sam had seen his parents, they were telling him they would see him soon. Charlie had confirmed they weren't coming back for him during a blazing argument. Over the years, all of them had been living in the home. Occasionally Mrs. Hilston had visited with prospective parents, but most of these candidates wanted cute babies, not kids who in a few years would be teenagers. As they got ready for school, Katie hissed to the others, "We are there for Jed, you hear? No one bullies him ever, especially that snake Simon." The boys nodded their heads in solemn agreement. Jed spent the day in his room, and refused to eat, despite Miss Goodwin coming up with a sandwich which was one of his many favorites. He felt hollow and empty, and didn't think he would ever feel happy again. He knew his mum wasn't in the best of health, but in his mind, he thought of her being in the hospital like a spa day or a holiday to get better so they could be together again. He had not even managed to give her a proper hug goodbye. He had no one now to protect him. Mrs. Hilston had told him that the doctors needed to examine his mum to make sure how she had died. She didn't expand on that information, but Jed knew that doctors cut dead people up. He tried not to think about his mum lying cold and alone, but the thoughts kept on coming into his mind, until in desperation he went downstairs to the kitchen where Miss Goodwin was making a pie. He startled her as he dashed into the kitchen, and collapsed onto a chair. "My head hurts," he complained. "Not surprised," she replied calmly. "I think you need a nice mug of tea." He shook his head no. "Well, my pie is just about to go into the oven, so I am having one, with biscuits." On hearing this word, Jed looked up. "Oh yes, we have a stash of lovely custard creams," she grinned. "And Charlie doesn't know where I keep them." She turned and got out 2 mugs and popped in a couple of tea bags, and a spoon of sugar. After brewing the tea in the mugs and fishing the bags out, adding milk and stirring, she put one down in front of Jed. "I'm sorry about your mum, Jed. What was she like?" Jed started to tell Miss Goodwin about his mum, all that he could remember. He finished with, "I don't want to forget her, but I already am." She looked at him calmly and said, "Well, in that case you need to write it all down, as much as you can remember. Things she told you, things she liked or hated. Her favorite songs, all of it. Then you can never forget, because it's all written down. Then she will be with you, forever." Jed realized that this made a lot of sense. He took a custard cream biscuit, and nibbled on the edge of it as he thought. He picked up the mug, and dunked the biscuit into the hot tea. He ate the rest of the biscuit, and took another one. "Help yourself, Jed, these are for you today." They sat in comparative silence, the clock on the wall ticking away. After drinking his tea and eating another 2 biscuits, Jed stood up and said, "Could I have an exercise book, please?" Miss Goodwin replied, "To write about your mum." "To remember, yes," agreed Jed. She walked into the office, and after a few minutes came out with a ruled notebook. It was pink and had a metal spine. "Charlie said you could have this one. It came as a free gift when the school sent a load of books over." Jed took the notebook. "Thank you for the tea and biscuits, I'm going to write now." He headed up the stairs with the notebook in his hand. Miss Goodwin sighed. He was so young, like all of them, all alone. Jed spent the rest of that first day writing his memories of his mum down. He heard the other children come up the stairs after arriving home from school, and then a small knock on the door. "Come in." Katie and Ben were standing at the doorway, looking scared. Jed realized that Sam must have been in detention. "You've heard?" Katie nodded, then came in and sat on the bed. "We," she said fiercely, pointing to each of them in turn, including Jed, "are family. No matter what." Jed nodded. "You're writing about her?" "Yes," Miss Goodwin suggested it. "We all did too, it helps when you can't remember. Mrs. Cooper is coming a bit later, Jed, she wants to check in on you. Dinner is in 15 minutes, its chicken pie smells amazing." "Yes, I was with Miss Goodwin for a bit," replied Jed, putting down his pen and shutting the book. He followed the others to the bathroom to wash his hands and face, then went downstairs where Charlie and Miss Goodwin were talking quietly. Jed could tell they were talking about him, but he didn't really care. He felt hollow and washed out. Miss Goodwin pulled the pie out of the oven, which Jed had to admit did smell great. She added large bowls of mashed potatoes and carrots to the table, and then started to slice up the pie onto plates. Jed took a small bite of his pie but couldn't really taste much. He was glad that the others came and saw him, but he was content just to sit with them all and hear about their day at school. In the back of his mind, his thoughts churned over. Everything is the same for them, my life has stopped. He put down his knife and fork and looked down at his feet. His eyes started to fill up again, and he choked back sobs. Miss Goodwin noticed and nodded to Charlie. "Come on, Jed, I can put your dinner back in the oven again." Jed stood up and followed her out into the hallway. She ushered him into the living room, where the voices of the others in the kitchen were a quiet murmur. "Sit down," she said kindly. "Now my advice is to not try to be brave. This is a time for you to show how much your mum meant to you, and if that means crying, then so be it. My old mum calls it cry for the dead and for the left behind, and that's a very good way of looking at it. You're sad because she'd gone, and you're sad because you are left behind." At hearing this, Jed stood back up and hugged Miss Goodwin hard. She returned the hug and let him weep until he was exhausted. Jed thought, "She smells of pie and flowers." He was strangely comforted by the closeness. As they stood locked in an embrace, the doorbell went. Charlie went to open it, noting that Miss Goodwin and Jed were in the living room. Jed heard Mrs. Cooper's voice and turned to see her coming into the room. "Jed, I wanted to come and tell you I am so sorry about your mum." Jed felt like crying again, hearing people acknowledge the fact, whereas he was hoping it was all a giant mistake, but instead he said in a low voice, "Thank you, miss. You will not be expected back to school for 2 weeks." Jed looked startled at this. "It gives you time to grieve, Jed, and if you need more time, just let Charlie or Miss Goodwin know." Charlie indicated to Mrs. Cooper to follow him, and Miss Goodwin ushered Jed back to the kitchen, where the others had already finished and left their plates by the sink. She fished out his dinner and said, "Could you manage a bit more dinner?" Jed tried to eat. It didn't taste of anything, but he felt sad that her lovely pie was going to waste. His mum was always keen to use up food, Jed knew, as they didn't have a lot of money. He managed about half before putting down his knife and fork again. "I'm sorry." "Don't be, Jed, it's not a problem." She swept up his food and popped the leftovers into a bin. "It will go to the pigs." Jed laughed. "You have pigs?" "Yes, my family own a small farm on the outskirts of the city. Maisie and Jasper are fine pigs and had a litter just last week. I can speak to Charlie and see if you can come and see them if you would like to." Jed nodded. "Yes, please." "Okay then. Well, as you are not at school for the next 2 weeks, you are going to be my helper, okay? You can start by scraping those other plates into the bin as well." Jed followed her instructions and started to scrape the leftovers. He noted that most of the plates were cleaner than his plate was. He felt bad again, but then reasoned that the pigs would enjoy the chicken pie more than he had. He put all of the plates onto the countertop. "Thank you, Jed. Now go and read in the living room until I bring in your hot chocolate." Jed went into the living room, where the other children were already reading. Katie had the latest Famous 5 story. Jed had been told all about her obsession with Enid Blyton. Sam had confirmed that Katie had persuaded Mr. Matthews to buy the whole collection, and she was now engrossed in the story. Jed picked up his book but couldn't concentrate on Space Wars Fact and Fiction. He stared at the pages but nothing was going in. "When is your mum's funeral?" asked Katie. "Don't know," replied Jed. "Mrs. Hilston said something about finding out what went wrong with her." Charlie came into the room with the hot chocolates, and it was clear he had heard the conversation. "Jed, as soon as we know when the funeral is, we can make arrangements." "What's the arrangement?" said Sam, confused. "The service," hissed back Katie. "Yes, the service," agreed Charlie. "Mrs. Hilston and the council are making the arrangements for your mum, Jed. She will be along again tomorrow." He put down the hot chocolates and patted Jed on the shoulder. Jed didn't feel comforted by Charlie as he did Miss Goodwin. He felt safe with her, but he didn't think Charlie really cared. The children sat in companionable silence, sipping their drinks. "You are all orphans like me then?" asked Jed. He'd never really thought about the subject before, the other kids had just been there. He had assumed that all of them too had family that would be along to collect them, as he had been. Not now. Katie nodded. The others shared their stories. Sam was the most emotional of them all, despite Katie's fierce outburst earlier. All of them realized that Jed had experienced real and true love from his mother for longer than all of them. Katie commented that she still sees flashes in her dreams of her mum and dad bent over her cot. "I'm not sure it's even real, but it helps me." Jed told the others about the memory book he was writing. "That's a really nice idea, Jed," said Katie. "I've said this to the others and now to you. You are our family, no matter what, okay?" Jed felt tears well up. He'd always wanted brothers or sisters, and now he had them. "Okay," he said softly, trying not to look at them. Cherrywood Farm. The following day, Jed woke up to find a baggy pair of dungarees, a sweatshirt, and a pair of Wellington boots by his bedside. Laid on top of them was a note. "These will keep you warm and dry today." He recognized Miss Goodwin's script-like handwriting. He had seen her shopping lists, which looked like Gothic church manuscripts. He quickly washed and dressed and joined the others downstairs in his socks, the Wellington boots held in his hands. He dropped them by the front door and went into breakfast. He realized he was really hungry, and after grace, Jed accepted a large portion of scrambled eggs and toast. Katie, Sam and Ben said goodbye as they dashed back upstairs to get ready for school. Jed sat in silence, enjoying the creamy eggs and buttered toast. Charlie was nowhere around, which was unusual in the mornings. Miss Goodwin noticed him looking at Charlie's empty chair. "He's off to the church meeting in Winchester this morning. Early start and won't be back until tomorrow, Jed. Now, do those wellies fit you?" "I think so, but I don't have any thick socks, just these." Jed put up one foot, encased in a thin cotton sock, for Miss Goodwin to see. "Well, those are no good for anyone, you will get blisters." She turned to a drawer and pulled out a sock. Now these will keep you both warm and comfortable today. My mum knits socks for charity, family and friends, and I asked her to make you a pair. Jed goggled at the blue and silver sock Miss Goodwin held in her hand. It shimmered and sparkled, and the silver thread looked like stars. Just one? No, she laughed, retrieving the other sock from the same drawer. 2 socks. They are made from wool and nylon, so they will be strong, warm and breathable. A hug for your feet from us. Here, try them on, over your other ones. The best cure for blisters is 2 pairs of socks. Jed put down his toast and went over to the sink to wash his hands, then sat back down and tried on the socks. They felt magical, soft to the touch, and immediately his feet felt warmer. Thank you, and thank you to your mum, Jed said delightedly as he picked up his toast again and continued to chew. Are we going to the farm today? Yes, once all the washing up is done. You can help me. Jed stood up after finishing his breakfast and brought his plate over to the sink. Now you stand on that stool there, Miss Goodwin said, and here is a tea towel. Now when I put something here in the draining rack, you wait a moment, then pick it up and dry it off. Okay. Standing on the stool, he could see Miss Goodwin move gracefully as she cleaned off scraps into the bin. Jed thought. The piggy's bin. Submerge the plate or cup into the warm soapy water. Jed had never lived anywhere where washing up was done. His mum had lived off takeaways or meals in exchange for cleaning work, so this was a whole new world to him. Miss Goodwin chatted as she washed, explaining that her family had lived on their farm for over 100 years. Her great-grandparents had moved to Exeter from Ireland via London to start a new life. Did you like growing up on a farm? Isn't it smelly? Oh my yes, she chuckled. Sometimes the stink of the cows is a bit much, but it's my life and I still love it. Jed continued to concentrate on each plate, cup or cutlery as he carefully dried each piece. Do you have a boyfriend? He asked, a farmer. Miss Goodwin smiled gently. It's hard to find a man who wants to be or is a farmer, she replied. Most of the farmers in the area are older than my dad, and these days women can make great farmers too. My mum does a lot of the work my dad does. They are a team. Jed thought that sounded lovely. As they washed and dried the plates and cups, Jed started to feel at peace. His mum had always said that some boring things were good for you, and he supposed that maybe washing up dishes was one of these. After a short while, the job was done. Jed went back upstairs to collect his coat before joining Miss Goodwin in the hallway. She produced a fluffy cream wool hat and gloves from her bag. My mum went a bit mad with the wool from Dolly, she commented. Jed looked confused. Dolly the sheep. She gave the wool you were wearing. The sock wool got dyed, but she didn't have enough time to dye and then knit up the other stuff. Jed laughed. Your sheep have names? Of course there aren't that many of them, she laughed, picking up the piggies bin. They made their way outside into the car park behind the home. Miss Goodwin walked over to a small white car. It was tiny. This is Yogi, Miss Goodwin announced proudly. Perfect for the traffic around this city. She unlocked the car and got in, putting the bin into the boot. Jed got into the passenger seat. There were only 2 seats, and despite its size, it was roomy on the inside. This is a TARDIS, Jed laughed. He loved Doctor Who but hadn't watched TV for a long time, not since the last squat with his mum. She too had loved the show, especially the Daleks. One of Jed's favorite memories was watching with her, them both curled up under warm blankets on a sofa in the squat, as the Doctor tried to foil these enemies of the Earth. Yes, it is a bit, Miss Goodwin agreed as they buckled their seatbelts and she started the car. She drove out of the car park and into the city traffic. She drove carefully but expertly across the city. Jed loved watching people as they drove past them. He wondered how many people would be meeting pigs and sheep today. He realized not many in a city like Exeter. After a few minutes, they got out of the city onto one of the country lanes that crisscrossed the county. The hedges were in full bloom, and the traffic started to ease in both directions. Jed could see miles and miles of fields with sheep and pigs scattered across them. He also spotted horses standing on a hill, and others running along a field at the top. After a short while, Miss Goodwin turned right into a long windy lane which led up to a farmhouse on another hill. The farmhouse looked very old. It was made of stone and wood. As they travelled carefully up the lane, they passed a sign which stated, "Cherrywood Farm." "Your farm is called Cherrywood?" Jed asked. "Yes, Jed, there is a cherry orchard in the backfield too. We have to keep the animals out of there, otherwise there is nothing left for us to make pies with. My dad likes making stuff out of wood as well. You'll see," she added, laughing. She pulled up in front of the house where a tractor was parked. Jed was amazed. He'd never been in the countryside, and although there was a scent in the air of cow poo, he liked the noises he could hear and the wind that blew across his face. "Now get your coat, hat and gloves and we'll go and see my mum first." Jed got out of the car with his belongings and Miss Goodwin pulled out the piggy's bin. She dropped it by the front door, walked inside and called, "Mum, I've brought Jed to see you." Jed followed her in shyly. He didn't really know how to meet people, and he stood behind Miss Goodwin. An older version of Miss Goodwin came into the hallway from a kitchen. Jed could see behind her. "Oh, Hilda, it's lovely to see you again. Come here, sweetie." Miss Goodwin's mum looked just as nice as she did, with an apron covered in flour and several spots in her curly hair. She had a warm smile, and Jed immediately realized she was also a nice person. She turned to Jed and smiled warmly. "Hello, Jed. I'm sorry to hear about your mum. Our Hilda said that you might like to spend some time with us. I've got a nice glass of warm milk for you to start with. Hilda, a cup of tea?" All of this was said in a soft West Country lilt, which Jed realized made him feel safe. She wasn't expecting a reply, but Jed nodded, as did Miss Goodwin beside him. They followed her out into a large kitchen, which was filled with pots and pans, and in the corner was an auger. Jed knew all about augers from John, one of the other people in the squat, who told him about them, and how he would have a house one day of his own, with an auger. Jed's mum and the others in the squat just smiled at the tales John told. They knew that, like them, he was unlikely to ever have his own house, and certainly not an auger. Jed sat down where he was told, at the massive wooden table in the center of the room. The table looked old and worn, but also looked like it had been scrubbed very well. He was passed a glass brimming with milk, and as promised it was warm. This confused Jed until the others noticed. "It's straight from Daisy," said Mrs. Goodwin. "She's just been milked this morning." Jed took a small, cautious sip. It was delicious. Not like the milk he normally drank at home, creamy and fresh. "Bit different from what you get from the milkman, eh?" added Mrs. Goodwin. "Yes, miss," said Jed, taking another long sip. He finished the milk, whilst Miss Goodwin and her mother sipped their tea and chatted. He liked being with them. It took his mind off his troubles and thinking about his mum. He was also grateful he didn't have to go to school for a while, and deal with all the stares and the comments behind his back. He was glad that when he did, his friends, family in the home would be there to support and defend him. Jed soon polished off the milk, and carefully put the glass back down on the table. A few minutes later, a tall, stout man walked into the kitchen through another door. He was over 6 feet tall, and wore a baggy woolen jumper and cord trousers tucked into warm-looking woolen socks. He didn't seem surprised that they had visitors, and Jed supposed this was Miss Goodwin's dad. "Hello," he said, "you must be Jed. My name is Gary, and you have already met my gorgeous Millie here," indicating Miss Goodwin's mum. Miss Goodwin and her mum giggled. It seemed that this was a common phrase said here in this warm and cozy room. Jed liked them straight away. "Hello," said Jed shyly. "Thank you for the milk." "Our pleasure, Jed. I'm just going to have a cuppa, then we'll take you out and show you the farm." Mrs. Goodwin. Millie, Jed thought, got up and poured a cup of tea for her husband. Their routines and habits were comforting to Jed, and he watched them fascinated. He'd not been exposed to many people who liked each other during his time with his mum. Some of the other squat inhabitants were keen to be together, but these relationships rarely lasted more than a few weeks before one or other of them would yell and scream and leave. He could see that both Millie and Gary and Hilda all liked and respected each other very much. His mum had not had any partners for many years, and Jed knew that his dad had been another resident of a squat back in London. He'd once asked his mum about his dad, but she had not given him any information and had been sad for the rest of that day. Jed learned not to ask awkward questions as he grew up, and his mum provided for him all he needed. Jed suddenly remembered his new socks, hat and mittens. "Thank you for my socks, hat and gloves," Millie replied. "My pleasure, Jed, it's nice to have someone to knit for. Gary and Hilda can only wear so many things I make. They will keep you warm on the farm today." 20 minutes later, Jed and Miss Goodwin pulled on their Wellington boots, coats and gloves, and followed Mr. Goodwin out into the yard behind the house. Miss Goodwin had the scraps bin from the home, which she carried out into the sunshine. On this side of the farm the wind was stronger, and Jed was glad of the warm clothing he was wearing. At the top of the yard was a large tractor with a trailer behind it. Jed gawked at it. It was bright yellow, and had huge wheels which were taller than any of them. Mr. Goodwin, however, lifted his leg up and hauled himself expertly into the cab of the tractor, then looked down at Jed, who felt very small indeed. He held out a hand, and Jed took it, feeling himself be pulled easily up into the cab beside Mr. Goodwin and sat down on a small pull-out seat. Miss Goodwin popped the scraps bin onto the trailer, then got in as well and wedged herself behind her dad. "Right, off we go," said Mr. Goodwin as he released the brake and started the engine. The tractor moved off out of the yard and onto a track across a field behind the farmyard. Jed had not been in the countryside at all before now, and the wide open fields and space left him in awe. Both Miss Goodwin and her father had grown up here, spending their days walking these fields. He felt completely calm as he sat beside Mr. Goodwin, as he expertly navigated the track down to a stream at the bottom of the fields. There were a collection of cows in one field and sheep in the other one. The tractor stopped, and Miss Goodwin got out from behind her father's seat. She walked around to the other side and opened the door, helping Jed out onto the grass. She walked back to the trailer and helped her dad pull off the feed for the cows. Jed knew Miss Goodwin was strong. He had seen her put heavy loads of laundry up and down from the utility room down at the home, but she lifted each sack without any apparent effort. Mr. Goodwin pulled out a penknife and slit the bag, picking it up as easily as his daughter did, and started to lay a trail out for the cows who had gathered around. These were small cows, brown in color with white blotches. They had big wide eyes and lashes which made them look like Disney characters. "They're Jersey cows," said Mr. Goodwin. "Great milkers and no problems." "Have you always had these cows?" Jed asked as one of them came up and nuzzled his shoulder. He didn't feel scared or worried. He was nearly as tall as most of the cows, and apart from the one, the others were more interested in the trail of feed Miss Goodwin was laying down. "Pretty much so, yes," replied Mr. Goodwin. "My grandparents came here from Ireland back in the early 1900s. They had been farmers in Ireland, but the owner of their land wanted more money which they couldn't afford. So they came to England seeking a new life, and this," Mr. Goodwin lifted his hands indicating the fields and house, "was the result after many years of hard work." Miss Goodwin came back after emptying the sack, and took down another one. "Enough chatter," she joked. "Jed, can you help me get these out?" Jed walked over to where she was cutting into the sack. "I'll hold it until it's about half empty, then you can take it over, okay?" Jed did so, following her as she laid another trail of feed on the grass. She stopped, then handed him the sack, showing him how to dispense it evenly. Jed walked along with several cows walking behind him, laying the trail as he'd been shown. When the bag was empty, he grinned and turned. Cows were eating along the trail. "Well done, lad," said Mr. Goodwin. "Fine work. Right on to the sheep next." Both Mr. Goodwin and his daughter picked up a different sack each, and opened a gate to where the sheep were crowded around waiting for their turn. All of them had only a limited fleece coat, and Jed thought they looked a bit cold and strange. Miss Goodwin pointed out one of the sheep which had a blue mark on her flank near her leg. "That's Dolly, who donated the wool Mum made your socks, hat and gloves from. Don't they need a lot of fleece to keep warm?" Jed said, feeling a bit guilty in his warm woolen items, but Miss Goodwin didn't laugh. "No, Jed, if one year's wool is not removed by shearing, the next year's growth just adds to it, resulting in sheep that overheat in summer. If they are not sheared, they have greatly decreased mobility and are in much greater danger from fly strike, all of which causes suffering and possible death. What's fly strike? Asked Jed, puzzled. Fly strike is a painful, sometimes fatal condition caused by flies laying eggs on another animal, which hatch into maggots and eat their host's flesh, said Mr. Goodwin. Jed was shocked. It sounded like something from a horror movie. We have to shear the sheep so that doesn't happen. Lots of what we do on the farm are to give our animals a better life, whether that's getting the vet out for a lame animal, to helping them when they are having little ones. Miss Goodwin came back for a second bag. Better give Hilda a hand, chuckled Mr. Goodwin. Jed helped Miss Goodwin with the rest of the feed for the sheep, who, like the cows, were happily munching on the trail that had been left for them. When all the bags were emptied and were back on the trailer, Mr. Goodwin indicated that they should get back onto the tractor. Jed found it easier after watching Miss Goodwin easily climb back into the cab, and he copied her and was soon back in the seat. Mr. Goodwin climbed back in, and after starting the tractor again, they made their way along the trail, towards more fields in the far corner of the farm. Jed could see trees in a high orchard ahead of them. As Miss Goodwin had already said, there was a strong fence all around the trees. The trees were in straight rows, but they didn't have any blossom on them. Those are the reason our farm is called Cherrywood, Mr. Goodwin said. My grandparents planted these trees in their first years here, and they have been fruiting ever since. Can you eat them? Jed asked. He had only ever had a cherry on a cake his mum had bought for him in a bakery near the squat. Yes, these are sweet cherries, Jed, replied Miss Goodwin. Mum makes amazing cherry pies with them. Mr. Goodwin looked out at the trees. A long time ago, Jed, down the coast there was an area called the Tamar Valley, which was so famous for its cherry blossoms that Queen Victoria visited them. Has she visited your orchard? Jed asked. Oh no, laughed Mr. Goodwin. She died in 1901 and my grandparents didn't make the trip over until 1903. Mr. Goodwin started up the tractor again, and moved off down the trail back to the house. Jed could see on the other side of the farmhouse a large field with a barn in the middle of it. The barn was mostly just a roof over the area. As they approached, Jed could see pigs in pens underneath. He could also hear them, rapid squealing as the tractor approached. Mr. Goodwin pulled up to the gate and got out to open it. Jed was surprised when Miss Goodwin hopped into the driving seat and started to move the tractor expertly through the gate. Jed's mouth was agape, and Miss Goodwin looked over with a chuckle. Been driving these things since I was younger than you, Jed. She drove carefully over to the barn, Mr. Goodwin closing the gate and following on foot. She parked up. Come on then, Jed, let's give these piggies their treats. They both got out and picked up the scraps bin from the trailer, then followed Mr. Goodwin into the barn where the pigs' noise got much louder. Inside were 5 pigs and the noise was tremendous. They know they are in for a treat, yelled Mr. Goodwin. Miss Goodwin opened the bin, which was very smelly, and tipped it up into a trough on the other side of the pen. The pigs immediately gathered and shuffled for a spot, and started to eat. The noise levels went back down to snuffling, which made it easier for Jed to hear what Mr. Goodwin was saying. These are British landrace pigs, Jed. They are the best pigs for our needs. That's Lucy, he said, pointing out one with a grey spot on her back. Samuel is the one with the yellow and blue mark, Kenny is the biggest one at the trough, and Harriet is the smallest one there, she's got a bit out of her ear. And finally, Hilda's favourite Maggie is the one snuffling around for the leftovers there on the ground. I bottle-fed Maggie, said Miss Goodwin as she came back over from the trough. Her mother rejected her as she was a runt. Doesn't look much like a runt now, does she, Jed? Said Mr. Goodwin, laughing. Do they get eaten? Asked Jed sadly. He knew from some of the people who were in the squat about vegetarians, and how they hated to see animals being killed for food. A couple of the people in the last squat were very vocal in their beliefs, and had been arrested a few times protesting outside the local burger shop. No, they don't, Jed, but we do have some pigs that are reared for meat, replied Mr. Goodwin. That's the life of a farmer, unfortunately. We grow stuff, and some of those things are animals. When these pigs have babies, we do move those pigs to a rearing shed for slaughter when they are 6 months old. Jed looked at the pigs in the pen and suddenly burst into tears. Oh, Jed, what's wrong? Miss Goodwin put down the bin and came over, bending down. Jed was mortified. He'd not cried since his mum died, but watching the pigs and knowing that their babies were dead had just overwhelmed him. She hugged him softly until he was able to talk. "They're babies," he sobbed. "Yes, Jed, it's a hard lesson. I'm sorry, maybe this wasn't such a good idea." Jed pulled away and gulped. "No," he said. "I'm sorry, miss." "Don't be, Jed, you are in shock with all that's happened. The pigs are not awake when they are killed, Jed. They don't know anything. We don't send them to just any abattoir. We have one who we know will look after them as carefully as we do, because we do care about them. All farmers care, Jed, but at the end of the day we raise them to make us money, and unlike the sheep and cows, pigs aren't useful for anything other than meat and eating the scraps." Mr. Goodwin looked kindly at Jed. Jed nodded and wiped his face with his sleeve. He knew that this was right, and that the pigs that the Goodwins looked after would have a good life. Mr. Goodwin passed over a hanky so Jed could wipe his face and blow his nose. "It's clean. Millie gives me a fresh one every morning, and I haven't used it yet," he chuckles as Jed tried to give it back. "No, that's okay, we have loads, you keep it." Jed tucked the hanky carefully into his coat pocket, as Miss Goodwin closed the gate to the pig pens. "I think we need to get back to the house for lunch," said Miss Goodwin. "Mum's been baking this morning." Jed followed Miss Goodwin back to the house, whilst Mr. Goodwin parked the tractor behind the house again. "Boots off," called Mrs. Goodwin. "Lunch is nearly ready. Get your hands washed, please." Jed followed Miss Goodwin's lead in getting her boots off and trotting into the kitchen before heading for the scullery where there was a large stone sink. They washed their hands before joining Mr. and Mrs. Goodwin back at the kitchen table. "Pie is steak and kidney. There is mashed potato and greens," said Mrs. Goodwin as she cut into the pie. Steam billowed out and the smell was amazing. Jed hadn't realized how hungry he was but accepted a huge slice of steaming pie. Jed was used to waiting for Charlie to say grace, and he was surprised that didn't happen here. "Go on, Jed, tuck in," said Mrs. Goodwin. "You don't say grace," said Jed, a little surprised. "We worship God by looking after His animals and His land, and each other," replied Mr. Goodwin gently. He smiled at his wife and daughter. Jed picked up his knife and fork and nearly moaned out loud. The pie was amazing. The others also started to eat, and the room was filled with silence until Miss Goodwin said, "Dad, I was going to bring Jed here for a couple of weeks. Is that okay? You could do with an extra pair of hands." Mr. Goodwin replied, looking steadily at Jed, who had looked up as his name was mentioned. "If that's okay with you, Jed. Hilda's right, we are coming into a busy time here on the farm. There will be plenty for you to do." Jed was delighted, but remembered to finish his mouthful before nodding. "Yes, sir, please." "Okay then, that's settled then." Jed realized he was truly content. Although the pain of his mum and the earlier crying had made him feel drained, the warm and comforting food and these people had calmed his fears about being alone. He knew he was safe here with them. And so for the next 2 weeks, Jed's routine became much different to his friends in the children's home. He had breakfast with Katie, Sam and Ben, but as they left for school, Jed got into the overalls that Miss Goodwin had adjusted for him. She had brought them back with her on the first day, and after measuring Jed up, she had taken them in and adjusted the length so they fitted. "These were a pair of Dad's old ones, so they will be fine," she said as Jed once again stood on the chair while she pinned and clipped the overalls. Each morning after breakfast, Jed accompanied Miss Goodwin back to the farm, to be treated to another glass of warm milk and a hug from Mrs. Goodwin as she started her morning bakes. One day near the end of the 2 weeks, Mrs. Goodwin stopped her baking and turned to him. "Your mum's in heaven with the Lord." "How do you know?" asked Jed. His mum had never been religious, but being at the school, he had learned that sinners went to hell. "Because she loved you, Jed. She brought you up to be a fine young man, and that means that in the eyes of God she is sin-free." Jed thought about this over the next few days and realized that in his heart he believed her. Better that than the furious God that the church school suggested. Each day Jed was led by Mr. Goodwin to a different part of the farm and did his best to help. After a few days, Jed was strong enough to manage the feed bags almost by himself. He enjoyed the process, and being out in the fresh air brought color to his skin. He also enjoyed visiting the pigs in the barn, and was quickly able to distinguish them from each other. Their noises of contentment when the piggy bin appeared made him laugh. As the final day approached, Jed was sitting on a bale of hay watching Lucy snuffle in the trough for treats she had missed. He was going to miss this place. Miss Goodwin came and sat down beside him. "What were your mum's favourite flowers, Jed?" Mrs. Hilston needs to know, as the council wants to put some flowers on her coffin. Jed knew the answer immediately. "Freesias," he said confidently. "Mum loved the displays of them in Cathedral Square by the church." "Okay then, freesias it is," she replied. "I'll let Jenny know. You can come back at weekends if you would like. But you also need to get back to school as well, Jed. I'm sorry because I know Dad would have loved to get you working here, but you are too young at the moment." Jed knew she was right, but he wasn't looking forward to going back at all. Simon Thomas. Simon Thomas was waiting for Jed on his first day back at school just before the Christmas holidays. The class had been told he was returning, and Simon nodded at his gang. They all knew what this meant. Simon had primed them during the time Jed was not at school. "We're going to give him a good welcome back, lads," said Simon one break time. He and his fellow bullies had taken over the bench at the back of the playground. "Thinks he's something special," he added with a grunt as he scuffed his shoes on the tarmac. "Well, let's welcome the little orphan boy back," he finished as the bell for the next class went off. Jed had truly dreaded his first day back, but Katie, Sam and Ben had walked with him, and Ben had tried to fly down the road to make him laugh. The sight of his friend frantically flapping his arms as he careered down the road did make Jed smile a bit. Jed went to Mrs. Cooper's office as he arrived. She was kind and asked him how he was feeling. Jed couldn't really answer her. His last 2 weeks were sad but also the best he had since before his mum died. She had been kind to him, but explained that apart from the day for his mum's funeral, which had finally been arranged, he was to be at school full-time for now. She knew that his mum's funeral was on Thursday, and said he would not be expected back until the following Monday. After leaving Mrs. Cooper's office, he walked down when the rest of the class was waiting outside Mr. Wall's room. Katie made room for him in the queue, despite mutterings coming from Simon Thomas and his friends about jumping in. Things only got worse from there on in. As they made their way into the room, Jed heard Simon hiss "orphan" behind him. Jed didn't turn around, but Katie glared at Simon as they walked to their desks. During Mr. Wall's French lesson, Simon and his friends continued to hiss at Jed, but made sure that Mr. Wall's back was turned at the time. The noise levels in the class disguised their bullying, until at one point the teacher happened to turn around just as Simon was mimicking crying into his hands. Mr. Wall swiftly walked up between the desks, Simon being the only one who was not paying attention, despite the gasps coming from those around him who could see what was coming. Suddenly his arm was wrenched upwards. Simon was startled to find himself looking into the furious face of his French teacher. "Simon Thomas, you are a pathetic bully who is going to spend the next month with me after school," said Mr. Wall with barely concealed rage. "Mrs. Cooper will be writing to your parents, and if this continues you will be expelled." Jed and the rest of the class looked at Simon, who was trying not to cry but had an expression of fury on his pinched face. "Now go and see Mrs. Cooper, and tell her what you have done. I will be checking on you later." Simon gathered his books and bag and stomped out of the room. "Now class, on to the next chapter," Mr. Wall said as he walked back to the front of the class. The room settled down, but Jed knew that this was going to make Simon and his friends more frantic about getting their revenge. He started to wish he was back at Cherrywood Farm. He daydreamed through the rest of the lesson, imagining he was back scratching Daisy behind the ears again, listening to the others grunting as they hunted for more scraps in their pens. During break time, Katie dragged Jed, Sam and Ben into the library. "He is pathetic," she announced, "but he is going to be even more furious now." Jed looked confused until she added, "Sarah Roberts, who lives down the road from Simon, told me that the police were called last time Simon got detention. His dad beat him and his mum up, and was arrested. If that happens again, I think he will try and take it out on you." Jed groaned. "Why me?" he asked. "What have I done to him?" "Nothing," Ben replied. "He picked on me last year just because he saw me wearing something he said was from a charity shop. When I told him I didn't care, He started on me, calling me charity boy every time he could. Nightmare. So we have to make sure that Jed isn't alone, Katie mused. We are fine for the walk to and from school, but we aren't in your English or maths lessons with you. Leave it with me, Jed. We will make sure that Simon decides to pick on someone else. They walked to the next lesson, which was Re. Miss Cartwright was on extended leave, due to the incident with the Action Man Jesus incident. She had not returned to the school the following day, and Mrs. Cooper had been forced to call the church board for a substitute. Mr. King was an experienced religious education tutor, and the class had quietened down when he first arrived. I will be looking after your class until the end of term, he announced, looking directly at Ben, who blushed, and as I am much taller, please note that any tricks will have to be higher than the last attempt. Ben looked sheepish and got out his books. The rest of the day passed without incident. Simon and his friends were sat at the other end of the canteen during lunchtime, and Katie did as she had promised. Jed was not alone in any of the classes or the times moving between them. She had asked one of his classmates in English and maths, a ginger-haired boy called John, to look after Jed. John had a crush on Katie and readily agreed. John was one of the taller boys in their year, and was currently the hero of the under-11s rugby team. Jed felt a bit embarrassed at first, but walking with John to and from the classes his other friends couldn't protect him in was comforting as well. Jed also found that he liked John as well. They had a love of space and science in common. John told Jed as they walked to their maths class that he had done an experiment in his mum's kitchen with a magnifying glass and her favorite lipstick, which rapidly melted all over her kitchen table. I was grounded for a week, he said with a chuckle, and no pocket money for 2 months until she was able to buy another lipstick in the same shade. It was worth it though. I'm sorry about your mum. Jed looked at John, who blushed. Katie told me. Hope that's okay. Jed nodded. He couldn't really speak when people were kind to him at the moment. 2011. The day Jed said a final goodbye to his mum was a bright and frosty one in early December. Jed had received a visit from Mrs. Hilston the night before, explaining that the council had made all the arrangements for his mum and what would be happening. They sat at the kitchen table with a cup of hot chocolate each. I will be picking you up, Jed, at 9:30 a.m. tomorrow. Miss Goodwin and Charlie will also be there, along with some of your mum's friends. Jed looked surprised at this. Whose mum's friends? He asked. Someone called Big Mike, she replied, came into the council offices the day after your mum died and asked the receptionist for the person looking after you. He's definitely a big chap, isn't he? Anyway, I came out into the reception, and he explained that he and some of your mum's other friends from the squat would like to be at her funeral. He came back yesterday and was told where and when, so you can expect some more people than just us there. Jed knew that the people in the squat were kind, but hearing that they would be coming made him feel warm and a bit teary. Mrs. Hilston noticed but didn't comment. Anyway, she turned to see Miss Goodwin coming into the room. Hilda found a suit which she has cut down so you could look your smartest. Jed turned to see Miss Goodwin holding up a black jacket and trousers. In her other hand was a clean white shirt with a black tie. Can you try this on, Jed? If it needs taking in any more, I can do that before tomorrow. Jed quickly tried on the suit. It fitted him perfectly. Both women looked like they might cry, but Mrs. Hilston just gulped loudly and said softly, "It looks perfect, Hilda, well done." Miss Goodwin added, "Your school shoes will have a good clean and polish too." Jed hugged Miss Goodwin tightly. "Thank you," he said, trying not to cry down his new suit. Miss Goodwin hugged him back without a word. He quickly got back out of the clothes, which Miss Goodwin then hung back up. She went out of the room. "These will be on your hanger in your room," she said as Jed sat back down with Mrs. Hilston. "The council is also arranging flowers. I understand from Miss Goodwin that your mum loved freesias." "Yes, she did," Jed replied, looking into his hot chocolate. "Well, that's what will be on her coffin." After finishing their hot chocolate, Mrs. Hilston said, "I will see you tomorrow, Jed." She hugged him around his shoulders and then left. Jed went into the lounge where Katie, Sam and Ben were trying to pretend they hadn't been listening to the conversation. "We wanted to come tomorrow," Ben said, "but Charlie said we had to go to school." Sam added, "But we are going to be thinking of you." Jed sat down and took out his book, but he couldn't concentrate. His tummy felt like he had drunk snakes, not hot chocolate. Jed was unable to eat anything for breakfast the next day, but Miss Goodwin just nodded and passed him a cup of tea. He tried not to look at the other children, who were quieter than normal. Even Ben just ate his eggs and bacon without a constant commentary about them, life, and the birds who had laid the eggs. Before they left Sam, Katie and Ben just placed their hand on Jed's shoulder without a word and left. He was glad they hadn't tried to do more to comfort him, but he knew that they would be there for him tonight and forever. Miss Goodwin started to clear the plates from the table and Jed helped. Keeping busy was good, and he concentrated on making sure each of the plates was scraped clean into the piggy bin and then placed on the counter ready for washing. Eventually that job was done, and Jed realized that he could delay no longer. He went up into his bedroom, where the suit was hanging up on the rail. His school shoes lay clean and polished beneath the suit. He looked at his suit, and then sat down on the bed heavily. He picked up the notebook he had been writing all his memories of his mum, and started to read it. His eyes started to fill up and tears dropped onto the pages, but he didn't stop reading. Miss Goodwin knocked on the door and entered. "Your mum would be so proud of how brave you are being, but you know that being brave is not the bravest thing you can do for her?" Jed looked up, his eyes still full of unshed tears. "Your mum would be even more proud of you for showing how much you care about her, how much you miss her, and how each and every one of these tears will keep her close to you forever. So don't think you can't weep for your mum. She knows how much these emotions will help you in the future." Jed looked at Miss Goodwin, though he still didn't really understand what she meant. He did know that by crying he did feel a little bit better, and the weight in his tummy was a little less hard. "So now go wash your face and clean those teeth of yours. I'll help you into your suit." Jed did as he was asked, and came back into the room where Miss Goodwin had laid out his suit. He quickly changed out of his t-shirt and trousers into the clothes. "Okay, Mrs. Hilston will be here in a few minutes. Go and sit in the lounge to wait for her," Miss Goodwin said. "I need to get changed too." Jed sat in his chair and waited. Miss Goodwin appeared a few minutes later. She had changed out of her apron and dress into a black dress that flowed around her like silk, with a matching black jacket with silver buttons. She looked beautiful, Jed realized. She had tied back her blonde hair with a black clip, and she had a small arrangement of freesias in her right lapel tied with a black ribbon. In her hand was another arrangement. "This is for you, Jed," she said, holding out the buttonhole. Jed stood still while she deftly placed the flowers on his lapel in the same place hers was. "Over your heart so you never forget her," she added. The doorbell rang, and Charlie went to answer it. He was also wearing a suit, but unlike Jed's one, it was a dark grey and it didn't really fit him well. Charlie almost never wore a suit at the home. The only time Jed had seen him in one was when the circuit superintendent ministers had come to the home for an inspection and a meeting. Charlie looked uncomfortable being in the room. He was never a source of comfort for Jed or the other children, and he didn't look like he wanted to start now either. Mrs. Hilston came into the room. She too was wearing a black dress, but her one was longer than Miss Goodwin's. Miss Goodwin passed her a buttonhole too. "Thank you, Hilda," she said softly as she put her buttonhole on her dress. "Okay, Jed, are you ready?" Jed really wanted to go back up to his room and never come out again. They all walked out into the car park. Miss Goodwin got in Mrs. Hilston's car with Jed in the back. Charlie walked over to his car. Mrs. Hilston set off towards the east of the city. The city was busy with cars and buses and pedestrians, but a short time later the cars pulled up outside the crematorium on Topsham Road. Mrs. Hilston parked in a space near the front door, where there were a few people standing around and talking. Jed looked over at the group of people. He recognized Big Mike immediately, though he wasn't wearing his favorite denim jacket and jeans. Big Mike was wearing proper trousers which looked a bit tight, and a nearly white shirt with a grey tie. He looked nearly as uncomfortable as Charlie was. Some of the other people Jed also recognized, but he didn't know their names. All of them were also wearing clothes he had not seen before. People in the squat rarely wore good clothes. The conditions they lived in meant that clothes didn't last very long either from the dampness or being nibbled by the rodents that also made their home there. Jed got out of the car followed by Miss Goodwin and Mrs. Hilston. Charlie pulled up his car next to them and got out. He glared at the group by the door, but didn't say anything. He shuffled behind the group and followed them all in. Mrs. Hilston nodded at Big Mike and the others, before leading Jed into the chapel. Jed had never been in a chapel before, but this one was beautiful. The entranceway led into a large room with wood panels on the floor, the walls and the ceiling which rose upwards into the roof. It was light and airy and didn't look like a church. Jed followed Mrs. Hilston down the aisle, to where a young woman dressed in a dark blue suit was waiting for them. She smiled at Jed and said, "My name is Jane and I will be conducting the service for your mum today." "Are you a vicar?" asked Jed, confused. She didn't appear to be wearing a dog collar. She laughed politely and shook her head. "No, I am a celebrant. That means that because your mum wasn't religious, we can talk in the service about her without religion, or we can include hymns if you would like." "She liked Morning is Broken," replied Jed firmly. "The hymn or the pop song?" asked Jane. "I don't know," replied Jed, confused. Mrs. Hilston nodded to the celebrant. "It doesn't matter, but as long as we can have it." Jane nodded. Jed's head was hurting. He didn't want to make a decision, and he was glad that both Mrs. Hilston and Miss Goodwin were there for him. Mrs. Hilston looked over at Charlie, who was by the front door, and said, "Jed, your mum's casket is coming, we need to go outside to meet it." Jed followed Mrs. Hilston outside with Miss Goodwin and Jane behind. In the distance, coming down the same driveway, was a sleek black funeral car. In front of it were two men in suits and top hats, walking slowly in time with each other. They matched their steps to each other, and the car behind them crawled along. After a few minutes, the men and the car arrived at the entrance to the chapel. Big Mike and the other people from the squat bent their heads. Jed carried on looking at the car. His mum was inside that box in the back. He could see flowers on top of the box. The men walked to the back of the car, and the driver and a passenger got out too. Together the four of them, all dressed in dark grey suits, opened the back of the car, and Mum in her box was lifted onto the shoulders of the four men. In unison they turned and walked into the chapel with the box on their shoulders, moving slowly. Jed wondered if the box was heavy. His mum had been a small woman, barely taller than he was and wiry thin. Mrs. Hilston ushered him beside her, and they followed them into the chapel again. Jed looked back to see Miss Goodwin and Charlie behind, and Big Mike and the others bringing up the rear. Jed had never seen Big Mike upset before, even when his dog had to be put down at the PDSA. Yet now Mike was walking behind the coffin, trying not to look at anyone, tears running freely down his face. The men arrived at the end of the aisle, and put the box down on a tall stand behind an arrangement of flowers. Jed was pleased to see the flowers on the coffin, and in the tall vase were freesias. His mum called them bunches of sunshine whenever she saw them in the florist's window displays. There were blue, white, yellow and even pink ones. Jed followed Mrs. Hilston to a bench at the front of the aisle, and Miss Goodwin and Charlie sat down beside them. Jed looked around again, and saw Big Mike being passed a large handkerchief from one of the other people there whom he thought was called Sid. All of the people Jed had seen in the last squat were there. He thought, 2011, there are more than 2011 people here for Mum. Jed looked back at the front of the chapel. The box his mum was in was a dark brown color and had handles on the side. The celebrant Jane cleared her throat and announced, "We are here to celebrate the life of Clare Long. Her family and friends are here to say goodbye." Jed looked down at his shoes as she continued to talk. Miss Goodwin slipped her hand into his and squeezed. Jed didn't look at her, but felt better for her doing that. He could hear Big Mike behind him sniffing. Jed turned his attention back to Jane, who was still talking about his mum. She had talked to people who had known her, Jed thought, as she commented on his mum's love of family and friends and her joy in being a mother. Jed listened more carefully to what the woman was saying now. He liked to hear that his mum loved him. He knew that she did, but sometimes when he was not being good, she would get annoyed with him. Yet when she had calmed down, she had hugged him and kissed his forehead. He missed her dreadfully, and despite trying not to, he followed Big Mike with tears running down his face. Miss Goodwin fished a handkerchief out of her bag, which wasn't as big as the one Big Mike had received, and passed it to him. Jed held it in his hand but didn't wipe his face. He remembered what Miss Goodwin had said, and let his tears show how much he missed and loved her. After the service was finished, the people attending started to drift up to the coffin, and many placed flowers on top of it. Most were freesias, but Jed saw Big Mike place a single red rose onto the top of the pile. Jed realized that Big Mike loved his mum, and that made his throat tighten again. Miss Goodwin, Mrs. Hilston and Charlie were the last to go up, and Miss Goodwin lightly touched the top of the coffin and silently mouthed something. Jed could not make out the words, but when she turned and saw Jed, he noticed that her eyes were full of tears again. Jed was the last to go up, and he placed his hand on the coffin. Was his mum still in there, or was she in heaven, as Mrs. Goodwin had said? He still thought Mrs. Goodwin was right. He turned and joined the others outside. Big Mike came over to him and bent down. "I'm so sorry about your mum, Jed. She was a lovely person." Jed looked up at the big man and said, "Thanks. Have you found another home?" Big Mike nodded, and put his finger to his nose in a gesture of confidentiality. He whispered back, "Nice place just down from the local church. Been empty since the owner died. Doesn't look like it will be sold anytime soon." Miss Goodwin came over to Jed and said, "We need to go now, Jed." Jed turned and followed her back to the car, where Mrs. Hilston and Charlie were waiting. Charlie looked like he didn't want to be there, but Mrs. Hilston was smiling at him. Next to her was the celebrant Jane. She held out her hand and shook Jed's small hand, then turned and went back inside. Back at the home, Jed went back upstairs and changed out of the suit, carefully hanging it back up again. He put on his sweatshirt and trousers plus the socks Mrs. Goodwin had made for him, then went downstairs where Mrs. Hilston and Miss Goodwin were chatting in the kitchen. "Sit down, Jed," said Mrs. Hilston. Jed did so. "When your mum's ashes are ready, you have a choice on where you would like them to be scattered or buried." Jed knew all about cremations. His mum was going to be or had been burned. He knew she didn't want to be buried. They had talked about things like that when he had been with her. Not often, just when a movie came on the portable TV where people were dead and coming out of their graves. Jed realized he probably shouldn't have seen these sorts of films, but he always felt safe with his mum, and he knew from her that this was make-believe. Jed thought on the matter for a few minutes. He needed to make sure she was in a pretty place. "Scattered in the cherry orchard," he finally announced, adding, "Please?" Looking at Miss Goodwin. She took a deep breath. Jed knew she was trying not to cry again. She nodded. "It would be our pleasure," she finally said. Jed was pleased. He knew his mum would have loved the view out over the hills, with the pink blossoms falling on the ground. Mrs. Hilston passed Jed a cup of hot chocolate. "Tell us about your mum, Jed." Jed did. He spent an hour talking about her, until he thought he had said everything he could remember. He was glad Charlie wasn't there. He didn't understand. Laid to rest. A week after the funeral, Jed was collected by Mrs. Hilston and Miss Goodwin, and driven back to Cherrywood Farm. There was snow on the hills, but they made good time on the roads. On Jed's lap was a grey plastic container that contained the ashes of his mum. Jed was wearing his funeral suit again, and in the jacket pocket, he had got his mum's memory book. Miss Goodwin had asked him to bring it with him, but he was confused as to why. She just smiled and said, "You'll see soon enough." Jed cradled the container on his lap, as the city streets gave way to the glorious countryside. As they drove up the lane to the farm, Jed could see the cherry trees on the hill, but they were bare of blossom still, their branches twisted. Jed hoped that there would be blossom in the spring. As the car pulled up outside the farmhouse, Jed could see Mr. and Mrs. Goodwin come out to greet them all. Mr. Goodwin had a clean pair of overalls on, and Mrs. Goodwin had a pretty dress on, though she was wearing a practical pair of shoes with them. "Hello," said Mrs. Goodwin as they all got out of the car. "We've done some tea for you all for afterwards." Jed was confused, but Mrs. Goodwin added, "We're going to have a wake for your mum, Jed, just us all. Is that okay?" "What is a wake?" asked Jed. Miss Goodwin turned to him and said, "A wake is for you, Jed, for the living. It's a chance for you to share your memories of your mum with us all, so we can remember her with you." Jed remembered the memory book, and realized why Miss Goodwin had asked him to bring it. Mr. Goodwin smiled at Jed. "We've got a lovely day for it." After a few minutes of chat in the yard, the group walked up the hill to the cherry orchard. Jed could hear the pigs grunting in their pens as they walked by. The container felt cool in his arms as he walked. Around him were people who understood, and didn't try and make him do anything. They just were. As they got to the orchard, Mr. Goodwin went ahead and opened the gate. Inside, the trees were bare. Mr. Goodwin walked to the last row of trees, which looked out over the countryside and the farm down below. "Is this a good spot, Jed?" Jed nodded. The sunshine on his face felt comforting. He knew his mum wasn't in this container, but he also wanted the place her ashes would lie to be perfect. This spot was. Miss Goodwin helped Jed to take the lid off the container, and then turned him around slightly so the light breeze was behind him, facing down the rows of trees. "What do I do?" he asked, suddenly frightened he was going to make a mistake. "Shall I show you?" she asked gently. Jed nodded. She took the container and turned it slightly downwards. Grey-white ash started to fall out of the container, and was immediately taken by the breeze down the row of trees. She tilted the container back up. "Like that," she said. Watched by the Goodwins and Mrs. Hilston, Jed mimicked her actions, and watched as his mum's ashes fell down and were picked by the breeze, moving like wisps of smoke onto the ground. He turned the container back upright again, then repeated the move again. This time the breeze took the dust, and Jed could see it dancing in the wind as it swirled and then landed on one of the smaller trees. Jed turned to Mrs. Hilston, offering her the container. She stepped up and took it from Jed. "Goodbye, Clare, we'll take care of Jed," she whispered as she turned it downwards. Miss Goodwin was next. Jed could see that she was trying not to cry. Jed turned to the Goodwins. "You both." Mr. Goodwin accepted the container from his daughter, and flicked it so the dust coming out went high into the trees. Mrs. Goodwin, like her daughter, was visibly upset, but also accepted the honor. Before Jed was aware, the container was passed back to him for him to finish scattering his mum in the beautiful orchard. He lifted the container, and tipped out the remaining ashes, which lifted up higher than any had done before. He watched as they sparkled and shone and moved off in the breeze down onto the trees. They stood for a short while watching the trees move in the wind, their branches creaking and groaning. Jed was calm and felt the warm sun on his face. He believed this was his mum bringing light to him. She was finally at peace in this beautiful place. "Thank you," Jed said. "For what?" asked Miss Goodwin. "For letting my mum be here," he replied. "She would have loved this place." Miss Goodwin was unable to speak, her throat had constricted, but nodded. Mr. Goodwin indicated the furthest tree in the row. "We thought that your mum's container could go there." Jed could see a spade leaning up against the tree, which was the nearest one to the view. He could also see that a patch of earth was piled up next to the spade. "If that's okay with you, Jed." Jed walked over to the tree and touched the bark, which was gnarly and old. "Yes, this is perfect," he agreed, turning around to face them all. He carefully placed the container, now empty, into the hole with the lid back on again. Beside him Miss Goodwin stood, followed by Mr. and Mrs. Goodwin, with Mrs. Hilston standing slightly further back. "It's traditional for family members to scatter soil," Miss Goodwin said. Jed picked up a handful of the soil and dropped it into the hole, where it landed on the container. "Goodbye, Mum." The others followed, each putting a handful on top of the container. Finally, Mr. Goodwin started to carefully put the soil back into the hole. Jed could see a patch of grass turf next to the hole. "There are wildflower seeds in that patch, Jed, so each and every year wildflowers will grow here." Jed liked that idea. Once the hole was filled again, Mr. Goodwin carefully placed the grass turf onto the hole and pressed it down with his foot. He looked over at Jed for approval, and was relieved to see he was smiling. They made their way back down to the farmhouse, and after washing their hands, Mrs. Goodwin brought out a feast of sandwiches, pies, cakes, and cups of tea for everyone. Jed was famished. He accepted sandwich after sandwich until he felt he started to look like one. After the meal was over, Mr. Goodwin stood up and ushered them all into the warm, cozy living room. In the hearth, a fire was burning which warmed the area around. They all sat down on the comfortable sofas near the fire. "Jed, why don't you bring out your memory book for us to see if you are happy with that?" asked Mrs. Hilston, who had been told about the book by Miss Goodwin a few days earlier. Jed took out the book from his pocket and opened it up. He started to read. "My mum was my best friend. She was sometimes sad but made me feel safe." Jed looked at the people in front of him. All were enraptured by his words, and even Mr. Goodwin appeared to be struggling with tears. He read in a clear voice his memories of his mum, her friends, and funny things she had done or said, and finished with, "And she wanted me to be a scientist, so that's what I will be." Jed looked up from the book. "I believe you will be a great scientist, Jed," said Mrs. Hilston. The others nodded in agreement. The rest of the afternoon was spent talking about Clare. Mrs. Hilston had known Clare the longest of all of them, even before Jed was born, and she shared memories of Clare which Jed thought he would also write down in his book later that evening. As the sky darkened, Mrs. Goodwin brought more cups of tea into the living room, and they talked about the orchard and Jed's mum. Jed thought it had been a really lovely day. Eventually Mrs. Hilston looked at her watch and announced, "I must get Jed back to the home, otherwise Charlie will send out a search party." Jed wasn't convinced that was true. Charlie didn't like the children in the home, he had realized. Charlie liked his job because most of the time there wasn't much for him to do, other than arrange the supplies of food and other items a busy home needed. Miss Goodwin did all the work, the cooking, and often the cleaning too. Jed stood up to say goodbye, and Mrs. Goodwin held out her hand. Jed ignored this and hugged her, which made her gasp in surprise. Looking up at her, he said, "Thank you for the wake." Mrs. Goodwin looked down and said sincerely, "Our pleasure, Jed. Everyone should have a wake." Mr. Goodwin also held out his hand, but Jed thought better of hugging him and accepted the handshake solemnly. "Come back in the spring and see the flowers, Jed." Jed then turned to Miss Goodwin, who was not coming back to the home that night. "Goodbye, miss. See you tomorrow." "You will indeed," she replied, accepting a hug like her mum. Jed then collected his memory book and followed Mrs. Hilston out to her car, where Mrs. Goodwin was passing her a large box of food. "For your office, Jenny, all those council workers need a good feed up." Mrs. Hilston accepted the box with a laugh and put it into the boot of her car. Jed got in and buckled his seatbelt. Mrs. Hilston waved at the Goodwins and started the car, carefully maneuvering it down the lane and back onto the main road. After about 20 minutes, Mrs. Hilston pulled up outside the children's home. Jed could see lights on in the living room, and knew Katie, Sam, and Ben would be waiting for him. As he came into the hallway and carefully took off his coat, the door to Charlie's office opened and Charlie came back out. "Hello, Jed. Hello, Jenny." Charlie looked awkward. "Jenny, can I speak to you, please?" Mrs. Hilston looked surprised, but followed Charlie into his office where the door was shut. Jed went into the living room, where he wasn't surprised to see Katie, Sam, and Ben reading. Jed did spot that Ben's book on dinosaurs was upside down. Katie smiled as he entered, and walked over to his chair before sitting down heavily. "How did it go?" she asked. Jed paused before speaking. He was exhausted, but he knew that the others wanted to make sure he was okay. "The Goodwins arranged a wake," he said. "What's a wake?" asked Ben. "It's a sort of party to celebrate the dead," replied Sam, who knew all sorts of things. "Sort of, yes. We talked about my mum. I told stories I remembered and pulled out his memory book. I read from this." Jed was about to add something else, but the noise coming from the hallway startled them all. It was the sound of the front door slamming. They waited to see if anything else would happen. Nothing else did, until Charlie came back into the room. His ears were bright red, but he didn't comment further, just placed their hot chocolate on the table and then left.